So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another live debate for World War II TV. I'm Paul Woodadge, and I'm hosting tonight. And joining me are four guests. It was going to be just three, but in the end, we have got an extra one in because why the hell not, eh? So, joining me, and we'll start with the furthest away. So, I'll put it on the gallery view. Is Dr. Mike Bechtold, who has done two of these before with us from Canada. Good afternoon, Mike. Thank you for joining us again.
Oh, my pleasure.
And another Canadian, but actually in England this time, Matt Bone is joining us. He was also on the June the 6th show. So Matt's representing Canada and I guess England and Typhoons, basically, I suppose.
I'm representing Typhoons of all nations, stripes and colors, yeah.
And then also in England is Adam Berry, who is an expert on troop carriers and the 82nd Airborne and lots of other things besides. And closest to me, just an hour or so down the road, Sean Claxton, who is a Normandy tour guide, who is going to join us and give a bit of a general idea of things. So Mike's expertise is air power and the Canadian military in World War II, and he's a doctor and author and historian and writes articles and edits magazines and serves on all sorts of boards and you name it, he does it. Matt is heavily involved with the restoration of the Hawker Typhoon in England and writes articles and things like that as well, and book reviews. And so Adam's a prolific author, and Sean's working on a book about D-Day bombers and projects as well. So I've got air power experts here. So the purpose of tonight is to just try and debunk a few myths, talk about air power in Normandy, and answer your questions that are coming in, and just discuss it, and kind of pub format, just generally chat around some ideas, and we'll see how it goes. So the first thing we're going to tackle, the first subject we're going to tackle is that of the troop carrier performance on D-Day. And I checked in a copy of a certain famous book by a certain famous deceased American historian today, and his words were about the American pilots on D-Day, the troop carriers. The pilots were afraid. For most of the pilots of Troop Carrier Command, this was their first combat mission. And the author was Stephen Ambrose, and that was in his book D-Day. And I'm sure some of you watching this are very aware of there are numerous cases for years of veterans of the troop carrier arm and sons and relatives and people saying that this is insulting to the troop carrier role, and people tried to communicate with Dr. Ambrose and didn't get responses. And he's not here to defend himself, so we're not going to drag him through the mud too much. But that myth about the troop carriers and their performance has endured, unfortunately, and it's something we'd like to discuss. So Adam, your first response to that is what exactly?
Yeah, interesting comment. One thing that I've always said to people is that, everybody has to start somewhere. Unfortunately, the nature of D-Day and the importance of D-Day and, everything that was being planned for it meant that there was a huge buildup of pilots and aircrew for the troop carrier groups and for 9 Troop Carrier Command in particular, to which all of the 14 groups were assigned for D-Day. Believe it or not, for the 14 groups that operated on D-Day, only 4 had prior experience before D-Day. They'd flown the missions over Sicily and Italy in 1943. But because the need for a delivery platform, for want of better terminology, for the 2 American airborne divisions was so massive on D-Day, the buildup of these troop carrier forces meant that inevitably a huge proportion of those guys were inexperienced and had never flown combat missions before. But as I've said, everybody has to start somewhere, and there's only so much preparation that you can do to prepare somebody for what they're likely to face over Normandy on that morning. Be it the Flak and other unexpected events that took place. Generally speaking, I think that the term, afraid is something that is not it's not incorrect. It's not inaccurate. These guys probably were afraid. But the same could be said for probably every single paratrooper that was on board their aircraft that night, you know, particularly the guys from the 101st and the 2 regiments of the 82nd that had never seen combat before. None of them really knew what they were about to face. And as I say, training can only take you so far. You know, you know, someone can fire a live round above your head in training, but you know that you know, you're not going to get, well, as a paratrooper, you may get killed in a training exercise or a paradrop exercise, but you know, generally speaking, you can only go so far into preparing people for what they will face in Normandy. So to say they're afraid is not to be too inaccurate, but to use it as a reason for the misdrops on D-Day, I would say probably is inaccurate. I think that their performances can be explained in other ways.
Well, I think it's the implication that afraid means unable to do your job, isn't it? And that's where it gets a little bit offensive. And as you so correctly said, and I'll welcome the opinions of others as well, is that a huge portion of all the people involved in Operation Overlord were inexperienced. Most of the divisions on the beaches were inexperienced. As you said, the 101st were entirely without combat experience. The Canadian 3rd Division, the British 3rd Division had been in combat for 4 years. The 50th have. The 29th haven't. So there's lots of people out there who've never done their jobs before. So that's hardly a revelation that they were not experienced. It's the implication that they performed badly. So I can go to Adam or I can go to anyone else as well. Sean, I mean, just briefly for those watching who aren't aware, you're a Normandy tour guide like myself. When we're explaining to people why the parachute jumps didn't go quite as well as intended, there are lots of factors why they didn't go as well as intended. Let's run through some of them now. I mean, give me a couple of reasons why things didn't go well that are nothing to do with pilot or aircrew fault, should we say?
Yeah, well, to go back to what Adam was saying, it's not so much the wording, but the implication from Ambrose, you know, that's the reason for their failure. And it's a little bit cruel, if you want a better word. There's other factors too, of course. Full moon, but lots of cloud. Just the stresses, if you like, because I say this is, whether it's the first time or not, this is still an operation, isn't it? So you've got all that extra kind of stress on your shoulders. Whether you've done it before or not, it's still there. The Pathfinders that mark the drop zones in the first place, if they're not dropped in the right place, everybody who's humming on the signal, of course, is going to be off course as well. So you've got that factor too. Anti-aircraft fire, which again, if you've experienced or not, is probably pretty scary. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of reasons. And as I think Adam said, you know, everyone was scared on both sides probably. But to offer that as an explanation for perceived poor performance, I think is a little bit harsh to say the least.
No, definitely. I'll bring Adam in a second. And I think, you know, that's the other thing that I think basing books, as Ambrose did a lot on oral histories, is everybody views things very much from their own point of view. And when you carry on, I was reading other books today, William Buckingham and James Holland, other books. A lot of the paratroopers were blaming the air crews for the poor drops, but the weight of their gear, that's one of the things I always get across, and I'm going to bring Adam in a second, is that if every paratrooper's got extra 30, 40 pounds of gear they've been stowing away just for June the 6th, knowing that it was the big one, you add that, multiply that by a stick of 19 or 20, you're adding a huge weight to the aircraft. And when the pilots came into the western coast and began to try and slow down to their intended drop speed, they were unable to do so because the paratroopers themselves were overloaded and it was putting that much strain on the aircraft. So the only way to avoid losing altitude was to put the throttle back and gain speed again. So the fact they were going fast, and I'm going to bring Adam in right now, is partly to do with the paratroopers themselves. I'm right on that, aren't I, Adam? And if I'm not, tell me I'm wrong.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that we found out in the myself and Hans in researching our book was that on most of the training exercises that were carried out over the UK, the paratroopers were jumping with little to no gear. So what that gives is from an aircrew point of view, is an inaccurate representation of the weight of what their aircraft will be on the actual operations. So, you know, those training exercises that were carried out in reasonably good weather, with paratroopers that are carrying little to no gear and that go really swimmingly. As I say, give a sort of an inaccurate representation of what it might be like for real on the night of D-Day. Myself and a friend who's an avid collector of gear have been over the last month or so, have been trying to figure out, you know, how much gear some of the heavier guys might have carried on D-Day. And we think that some of them would have been carrying up to or close to around about 100 pounds of gear. You know, this includes their parachutes, their Mae Wests, their M1, you know, aside from the basic gear as well, the 101st Airborne Division were issued leg bags, which some of them use to carry tins of, you know, machine gun ammunition. You know, you've got the one guy in one of Michel Detray's books that carried his 30 cal in his leg bag, which, you know, is not a great idea if you ask me. That's what the equipment bundles are for. So when you take into account the weight of the individual, plus the weight of the gear, plus the weight of the equipment bundles under the aircraft, which, dependent on what they're carrying, could be anywhere between 600 to 900 pounds of gear, the aircraft were seriously overloaded for the operation. This becomes a problem when they encounter a cloud bank on the west coast of the peninsula that they weren't expecting. So to counter this, what a lot of the aircraft did was they flew above the cloud in order to be able to maintain a tight formation. The other option is to basically break up the formation in the cloud to avoid the possibility of aerial collision, which we can potentially come back on. But if you climb your aircraft up to where the ceiling of this cloud is, which if one of the group is 6,500 feet, all of a sudden they break free of this cloud. They've got 5 or 6 miles in which to descend their aircraft to the right jump height whilst maintaining the right jump speed. Now, one troop carrier veteran tried to describe this in a way that most people would be able to appreciate, which is trying to slow down a vehicle on a very steep hill without using the brakes and without using engine braking or anything. You know, how do you do that? How do you maintain a speed trying to descend an aircraft that's overloaded with weight and get it in time to the right jump speed and over the right drop zone? It's virtually an impossible task to achieve for the pilots. They actually did have a number of ways to do this, which actually goes some way to explaining some of the erratic behavior that the paratroopers comment on D-Day. So one thing was to drop flaps, for example, was to kick the rudder left and right to create, you know, aerodynamic instability, which created drag. And another method that they used was to completely lower the throttle of the aircraft's engines, lower the manifold pressure on the aircraft engines so that they were virtually idling. This forced the propeller to spin in the wind, which created an air brake effect. But to the paratroopers on board the aircraft, what this sounded like was the pilots completely gunning the engines. So the aircraft is becoming, you know, very unstable. It's being rocked from left to right, and in some cases, the pilots are even dropping the undercarriage in order to create drag to slow the aircraft down. So to a paratrooper that sat in the cargo hold of a C-47, feeling the aircraft being rocked left and right, the engines really sounding as though they're being gunned, you know, they don't really have an appreciation or even really know what's going on. You know, they think the pilots, as some have claimed, trying to avoid flak, you know, or increasing the aircraft speed to basically get themselves the hell out of there. So as you can appreciate, the job for them, the moment that this cloud bank is hit, they're faced with a decision that they didn't know they would have to face, which is fly above it, fly below it, in which case you become more susceptible to flak and you're flying too low, or fly right through it, in which case the formations have to be fanned out. They have to break the formations. And it's at that point you begin to get singular aircraft flying in directions because they just can't reform in time before they reach their drop zones.
I mean, I think another point I want to just quickly bring up is that, and it occurred to me a second ago, is that the paratroopers, and by that I mean American, British, and Canadian on D-Day, they've been trained to believe they're the best of the best, that no one else can match them. They are unrivaled, that they are supermen. And I think that may have lent itself to their consideration that anyone around them is therefore not very good at their jobs anyway, regardless of how the troop carrier pilots and crews were performing. It was a negative of their own training. And so I also want to bring Mike in, because Mike's been sitting there patiently anyway, because I have to say I'm not really sure what the Canadian view is of the troop carriers on D-Day, because your involvement was relatively small, 1 battalion, on D-Day, attached to the British Airborne Division, 3rd Parachute Brigade. But within your academic circles, Mike, is there has it been discussed? What's your Canadian view of the troop carriers generally on D-Day?
Yeah, I have to say I haven't really seen anything specifically about what the Canadian paratroopers were talking about the troop carriers that took them over there. But like all the paratroopers that were dropped on that day, they were widely scattered. They had their objectives, the bridges that they had to blow up, and supporting the attack on the Merville battery. And they didn't have near enough troops to really do any of those objectives. They got some of them accomplished, but not all of them. And then as the day progressed, they concentrated in the Le Mesnil crossroads to defend the perimeter, and were there for weeks, did a really good job. Somebody commented on YouTube, Sheldrake 6, that Dan Hartigan, who wrote a really exceptional memoir of his time in Normandy called forgetting the name right now.
A Rising of Courage.
A Rising of Courage, thank you very much, which is a fantastic book in so many ways. But Sheldrake mentions that Hartigan couldn't believe that the drops as scattered weren't planned, and that doesn't ring true to me. I think there's no evidence in the documents that they planned to scatter them as a way of confusing the Germans. They may have talked privately about the fact that a scattered drop could have an unintended consequence, but all the aircraft had specific objectives, specific drop zones. The troops had specific tasks, and the intent was to put them there so they could carry them out. So all this talk about the consequences of scattering them and confusing the Germans, and the Germans not figuring out what was going on, was a fortuitous side effect of the scattered drops, but I don't think it was in the plans whatsoever.
I mean, I'll ask Sean his opinion as well in a second, but I have to say, I think the misdropping of the parachute, particularly the American ones, I think has been overdone a bit anyway. I mean, this idea that they're 2 or 3 miles away from their drop zones, well, they're paratroopers. They can run that before breakfast without breaking a sweat. If they were 30 miles away, and some of them were 15 miles away, the guys at Granier, for example, and there was a Canadians off towards Le Havre, that's significant. But when you're 2 or 3 miles, even 4 or 5 miles away, it's not an insurmountable distance, is it? I mean, I understand that it all depends on whether you know where you are. That is, of course, a big part of it. If you don't know which direction to move and you're on your own, it makes a difference. But I think being inherently 2 or 3 miles away is not going to incapacitate your average paratrooper. What are your views on that, Sean?
Well, yeah, I mean, the focus seems to be on the American troop carrier squadrons. But if you look at the drop patterns of the British Canadian paratroopers, they're as scattered. They have the same maps produced with the little dots showing where people landed. They're just spread out. And I think in Hartigan's book, he mentions about one steed landing the other side of Le Havre. Yeah. So across the same river, which is, a fair old way. And I think another lot landed behind Juno Beach, which is, that's almost like a 30-mile spread. But for some reason, the focus seems to be, I think perhaps because of the author you mentioned earlier, on the Americans rather than the Royal Air Force and their job. But what you're getting at, there is, of course, the positive of confusing the Germans as to what on earth is going on. If everyone had landed in their correct positions, then they weren't stupid. They could have worked out what was what and likely objectives. But the fact they're spread out, and I don't think it was deliberate at all. I think it was a happy coincidence, if you like, not necessarily for the men that were dropped in the wrong place, but for the the bigger picture, that it did sort of slow down the German reaction. Because they don't know exactly what to do. And if you add into that the Titanic operations as well, the Germans they're just, they're dithering as opposed to getting about stuff because they don't really know what to do, which is the real group of paratroopers, which is the fake ones, which are the ones that are just lost. And they don't know really where to focus their attention initially. So yeah, there is that positive, but I think I agree with Mike. I don't think it was at all planned. It just happened to, have this kind of positive side to it.
Yeah, and I we have to look at the fact that despite its eventual success, the Allies never really, we didn't do nighttime jump scan. We continued with the idea of daylight parachute operations for the rest of the war. So we got away with it, but I think it's natural. We've talked about this in other one of these broadcasts. It's natural to try and want to blame someone for something when something doesn't go very well, and it does seem unfortunate for decades the troop carrier pilots and crews seem to get the blame. And Adam, what do you think do you think it's changed now? Do you think the tide has turned? Do we finally think that there is people are well, I'm putting Adam on now, getting the picture that it is the troop carrier guy did a good job. For some reason I can't pin.
Can you hear me okay, Paul? Because I think my camera might have frozen. I think that might be why you're having problems. I'll sort that out in just a moment.
Okay, well, this one while we're waiting for your camera to come on, Matt. I mean, you've been sitting. Have you read anything about troop carriers? What's your feeling on that, Matt?
Well, for me, I think that's a fascinating thing is the different aspects of it and how influential Ambrose has become in sort of the sort of wider public's understanding of it. A lot of the research that I've been doing is our aircraft is slightly later than D-Day, so I've spent a lot of time reading about Operation Varsity, which came with its own problems, daylight drop, massive things, but included the C-46, which had immeasurable problems when compared to the DAC. But from my reading on it, I think you have a lot of aircraft in a confined space at night, bad weather that they weren't necessarily expecting, and then throw into that something which I'm sure we're going to discuss at length, but Flak, which is, from every account you read, no matter what you're in, it's a terrifying experience. So when you have to be at a certain place at a certain speed and a certain height to make sure the guys that are in the back of your plane are able to jump, all of those pressures into one spot is must have been absolutely terrifying for the crews, let alone the paratroopers making the jump.
Yeah, well, we have Adam back now. So Adam, just to confirm, do you think the difference has been? Do you think people understand now the troop carriers are badly blamed? And also, I want you to talk about the fact that the troop carrier commanders were mostly in receipt of congratulatory letters from the two divisions, the 82nd and 101st after D-Day. So this idea that they weren't acknowledged as being a part of the success is nonsense, because they were congratulated. So if you could talk about that, great.
Yeah, I mean, oddly enough, although I think that there's a slow sort of change in the mentality of most people in terms of the way that troop carrier crews are perceived. It's a strange thing. Last year when we had the Dax over Normandy event and the Dax over Duxford events, they emphasised to me just what love there is for the actual aircraft itself. It was a well-received event. As you and I both know, Paul, it wasn't the most amazingly well-organised event, but it was. But as I say, it emphasised just what love there is for the aircraft. But oddly enough, not a great deal of love for the actual, the guys that actually operated them on a day-to-day basis, and that interest is gaining some momentum, but it's still not. It's still not where I would quite like to see it, but that's potentially a slightly biased opinion. But yeah, I mean it's something that as I say, myself and a number of we are like to call the troop carrier fraternity of guys, but like Neil Jones, for example, who's helping to restore Night Fright, and Pat Ellie, who I'm sure you'll know quite well. Yeah. And other guys like Hans, my co-author, are really trying our best to try and give the troop carrier guys a bit more credit for the jobs that they carried out, and to try and dispel the myths. What I don't think helps is that obviously, like Matt said, a guy like Stephen Ambrose he's got massive reach. His books like Band of Brothers are bestsellers, and probably he's probably sold more books than a lot of authors have combined. So the problem that creates is that so many people read it and we take it as gospel, and that becomes, you know, the go-to sort of explanation of what, you know, how the troop carrier guys performed. You know, what also doesn't help is the reason that I sort of got my knickers in a twist about it, for want of a different terminology, was most recently was in on James Holland's podcast, and I've got a great deal of respect for James as a historian, but in one of his more recent podcasts, he sort of referred to troop carrier guy, the whole airborne process of being the delivery of your best troops by your worst aircrew. And that kind of, you know, got my back up a little bit, because it's, again, you know, James's podcast hits a great reach, and to say something like that, you know, it's a bit unfair. And, you know, to go on and say things like, you know, they were the dregs of the United States Air Force aviation cadet program. Again, it doesn't really hold water. There's no evidence to suggest that troop carrier pilots were, you know, lower grade graduates of the aviation cadet program. You know, at the height of when they were really trying to bring guys in, you know, which is mainly, you know, most of 1943, early 44. You know, the remits of how they were distributing their pilots weren't necessarily on how good they were as pilots. They were more based on their physical attributes as opposed to anything. You know, take, for example, you know, the parameters of what made a fighter pilot. You know, you couldn't be taller than 5'9" or weigh more than 160 pounds. So you could be the greatest pilot in your class, but because you're 6'10" and weigh 165 pounds, it prevents you from being a fighter pilot. So you're pushed into other branches of the US Air Force. And, you know, when D-Day was being planned and there was this great push being made to create more troop carrier groups to meet this requirement to be able to deliver the airborne to Normandy on D-Day, you know, that was where pilots were being pushed. You know, they were being pushed in the direction of training to fly twin engine aircraft, and they became troop carrier pilots as a result of this. So I think that, you know, and you know, a lot of the time they're off the cuff comments, but they can be extremely dangerous.
Yeah,
you know,
I
extremely
agree.
Damaging to, you know, to the reputation of the troop carrier crews.
I think there's also been a tendency to for the layman to lump in troop carrier pilots with glider pilots as well. And we as the Brits here, and Mike, our two Canadians, we have the glider pilot regiment, which I have to say is one of the shining examples of one of the best things the British did in World War II. The idea of the glider, I mean, people like Jim Walwork, incredible pilots, and also take the perimeter at Arnhem when the glider pilot regiment took a huge chunk of the defense there. They're all trained ground soldiers as well. But comparing that absolutely exceptional program and going across to the American glider pilot system, it's apples and oranges. It's not a fair comparison. So I think that has, I think, and James, you know, James Holland, you mentioned, is a, you know, real big Arnhem fan. He and Al Murray love Arnhem and glider pilot regiment. It gives another bonus to the difference between the glider pilots in the British Army and the troop carrier crews in the American. And this myth that's persisting. That's it. It's yeah, you're right. That was not a very nice thing to say, in that, you know, implying they are the dregs. I mean, I've met a few glider pilots, not as many, troop carrier pilots like you have, Adam, and none of the ones I met gave me the impression they were anything other than incredibly gifted, talented individuals. So,
yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you know, these guys were trained to fly aircraft, and if they weren't good enough, then they didn't graduate. You know, it's, you know, the Air Force could ill afford to put guys in control of these, you know, and as James quite rightly pointed out, they are going to be tasked with delivering the Allies, you know, what were among the Allies' best soldiers. You don't really want guys who don't know what they're doing, or you know, haven't got the necessary skills to fly the aircraft to the best of their abilities, you know, tasked with that role, you know. So it's
I suppose it's also, sorry to interrupt, also, if you're a bomber, well, we'll touch on when we go into bombers and fighters later on. If you're a bomber pilot, then you're likely to get a good fair few chances of perfecting your skill. Troop carrier pilots dropping paratroopers, you might get theoretically you could get 4 operations under your belt in the ETO in World War II, couldn't you? I mean, you could have kind of done Sicily, Italy, but you're not going to get up to 5 or 6. So your day-to-day job is doing other stuff, isn't it? It's supplying actual items and or drops of equipment and things. So you're never going to get brilliant at something if you only ever do it 3 or 4 times.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. I mean,
Matt, I mean, to give me an idea, how some of your Typhoon guys, how many sorties have they flown? Some of your favorite guys?
Well, 90 tends to be the bit when you get tapped on the shoulder and sent home.
Yeah, so I mean, 90, you know, you'd think after 10, 20 of them, you're going to start getting good at it. So, you know, I think your point was very valid, Adam. You know, that things like the Operation Overlord and the crossing of the Rhine, they are huge, massive, great operations with high risk, lots of potential things that can go wrong. And to just criticize pilots, even if they did do a bad job, for those very infrequent operations is very unfair, given that they were doing it not very often. I mean, anyone else want to jump in and add anything on that subject?
Can I just say something about that?
Yeah.
Just quickly. Going back to the stress thing, if you're a bomber pilot or a bomber crew, shall we say, and you miss your target, what happens? Well, you go and try again the next day, don't you?
Yeah, exactly.
You can't do that carrying live cargo. You know, you've got to get it right first time. So that adds to that stress and that pressure. It has to.
And you've got human beings who can criticize you,
and
whereas bombs can't send a report back, can they?
Well, it's funny
you can't go back tomorrow and drop again, you know?
Yeah.
It's funny you should say that, because in our book, you know, it seems like odd terminology to use, but I said that because one of the earliest guilty authors, for, if you want to call it that, was SLA Marshall, who after he released I believe it was called Night Drop. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head.
Night Drop. Yeah.
He later admitted it, but during the process of writing that book, he didn't interview a single troop carrier pilot. And I compared this to was for a bombardier missing his target and somebody going and trying to interview the bomb. Well, you know, why did you hit the wrong target? You know, it's, you know, asking a paratrooper why he was misdropped. It just doesn't make sense. They've got no understanding of what it takes to fly the aircraft, to navigate it to the right point, and to make that drop accurately. So again, as I say, it might be odd terminology, but going back to the whole bomber thing, you know, you get a second chance to do that job again. You know, you misdrop as a troop carrier pilot, and you know, inevitably, as we know on D-Day, it can and does cost lives. So, and not only that, but in the run up to D-Day, they know it's coming. There's a huge pressure on them. You know, they know that they're going to be delivering airborne troops, but, you know, that have got all of, you know, you get all of the old cliches, that they get all the women in there, you know, they're highly respected and all of that side of things. And, you know, to be told, you know, and we know it from looking at the troop carrier, you know, some of their diaries that on the training exercises, when the airborne troops come onto the airfields and they're put into their marshalling yards to prepare for even just a training exercise or for the real thing, the admiration that the troop carrier pilots have got for them is really evident. You know, they know that these guys are the very best at what they do, you know, and so they take a great deal of pride in being the guys that are tasked with delivering them to combat.
That's good stuff. And I think we could end up spending the whole night just about troop carriers, but we'll go back, because I want to bring you in later on, Adam, in the troop carrier role beyond the D-Day, because, you know, we focused on that June the 6th role. Of course, there's a lot more to the story that we can bring in later on, but let's bring another topic in. And one of my favorite ones I wanted to bring in is aerial reconnaissance, the use of our aircraft in taking photos of the battlefields. And because to me, that is one of the most extraordinary aspects of the Normandy campaign, and indeed World War II generally. And I was reading a piece we're going to reference again today later on, and it's about 83 Group. And 83 Group in June, July, and August flew 1,240 aerial reconnaissance sorties, taking 143,000 exposures. That we produced 1.5 million prints of these photos that were used to plan and our operations on the ground. I'm going to share I've got the odd photo ready to go. I've not got many tonight, but I'll bring up a photo of a WAF there with an aerial photo looking at some or other, and the special glasses that gave a 3D view and what have you. And we did our Suffolk show last night about the attack on Chateau de la Londe, that I'm sure when the officers were huddling around the briefing for that attack, there were aerial photos there they were using because it was one of the aces we had. I'll show another photo briefly of Merville Battery. And this photo would have been taken in advance of D-Day. In fact, multiple photos taken on multiple sorties showing what was happening with the way of building and what was happening in terms of new defenses and minefields and anti-glider defenses, all that kind of stuff. And this is one of our aces. So I'm going to bring in Mike in because I know Mike has actually written an article, or if not a book, about aerial reconnaissance. So Mike, how important was the use of aerial reconnaissance, and how did it all kind of begin? Give us a bit of a layman's idea about the use of photo reconnaissance in World War II.
Yeah, I don't think you can underestimate how important aerial reconnaissance was in the Second World War. I mean, it had its roots in the First World War. Aircraft were used for reconnaissance. At first, you just had guys using their eyes to report back on what they saw and what they detected, but it became quickly apparent that the pilot's eyes weren't necessarily the most reliable and able to share that information. So they started taking pictures, and it made a huge difference, and it was essential for intelligence, planning operations, guiding artillery, things like that. And it continued to be of exceptional importance in the Second World War. I mean, there were squadrons that were devoted to strategic reconnaissance, which is looking deep behind the enemy lines, and tactical reconnaissance, which is looking very close behind the enemy lines, trying to find what the enemy doesn't want you to see on the other side of that hill, where their tanks are, where their headquarters are, what they're planning to do. And it was incredibly important. And they were able to share these photos right down to the lowest levels. Individual platoons would get air photographs of their objectives, and it was essential for how they planned their operations and decided where to go, where there might be minefields, where there might be ambush points and places like that. So air photos were extraordinarily important. And sort of tangentially to that, they're absolutely essential for the historian today as a way of trying to understand what's going on. There's large collections of air photos that are still in existence today. Probably the biggest one is the one that's at, is it at Edinburgh University now?
Edinburgh,
yeah, it's bounced around a bit. But Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo has an enormous collection as well that I was lucky enough to work with for the better part of 20 years. And they have tens of thousands of aerial images from 43, 44, and 45 that trace the route of 1st Canadian Army from the D-Day beaches right up to the borders of Germany. And I can't tell you how many hours I've spent going through those images, and the things we've been able to find are absolutely remarkable because it's the closest thing we have to a snapshot of a battle in progress. So you can go back and you can look at the D-Day beaches photographed that day and see where the troops were. You can get a sense of where they were going, what they were doing, what obstacles they had. Terrain is one of the most important things for any historian to understand. And while it's possible to go back and look at the battlefields today, oftentimes things have changed. But if you look at these air photographs, you can see things that are gone now in terms of where roads were, where the airfields that 2nd Tactical Air Force used and stuff like that. One of the most remarkable things I ever came across was a series of air photographs showing Worthington Force in August 1944. And the story of Worthington Force is one of the great tragedies of the Canadian Army in Normandy. It was a battle group of the Algonquin Regiment and the British Columbia Regiment, a tank regiment that broke through German lines but got lost. Nobody knew where they were, and they were eventually destroyed. It could have been the great breakthrough the Allies were looking for, but in the end, the battle group was destroyed. But I found air photographs taken of the battle group hours after they'd crossed the train that explained why they got lost. And without those air photos, we never would have known sort of how that had happened or why that had happened. So these air photos were an immense resource for the men at the time, and they continue to be a fantastic resource for us today.
Well, superb stuff, Mike. And just because I don't know, I'm genuinely intrigued by this. How did the pilots end up getting assigned to aerial reconnaissance? Was it an aptitude test? How did it work? How did it work? Give me some more information because I have no idea.
Actually, that's a really good question, and maybe Matt can chime in on that. My sense is that pilots were more selected to go where they were by luck, by chance,
Right.
by what slots were needed at what time, very much like Adam was talking about with the troop carrier pilots. They were sent there when they were needed. So there's a great story about 3-wing Royal Naval Air Service in the First World War that was largely a Canadian unit. And there's a lot of talk that it was created to be the first all-Canadian unit on the Western Front, but that's balderdash. Essentially, there was a whole bunch of Canadian pilots that were graduating from flight school at the time this unit was being put together. So they all went off to join 3-wing, and it became mostly Canadian out of happenstance rather than intent.
I mean, Sean, what's your take on aerial reconnaissance? I mean, you're a battlefield guide like me, so you spend a lot of time on the ground. So I mean, obviously they're important to us, but back in '44, how important were they for the Allied advance?
Well, yeah, like Mike said, it showed you stuff that you couldn't find out in any other way, really, about whether it be defenses or terrain features and so on. I don't know about you, but I have a reasonable collection of aerial photographs back from when it was the British ones in Kiel, I think, originally.
Yeah.
But yeah, I still use them a lot because, as Mike said, you can see how things have changed, where there used to be a hedgerow and there isn't now, where there's been build up of urban areas and that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, it was massively important. There's no other way of expressing that. I think you mentioned about the German, or you haven't yet. The German area reconnaissance, because that did exist.
They haven't got much, have they, really?
Well, no, but they say exactly. They just don't have the ability to take whatever it was, 14,000 prints over 3 months. So there are German aerial reconnaissance photographs.
40,000 prints, yeah, crazy.
So it's.
I think I have to give it to play, just the devil's advocate here. I think one of the, although the aerial reconnaissance photos are incredibly important, I think they can be a little bit dangerous as well. I think possibly, and I'm not going to get into the cliche too much of talking about the bocage too much, but they can also show what appears to be a clear sector that actually has plenty of troops hidden inside it, inside the camouflage of hedgerows and underwoods and things. So I think a photo with nothing in it might get, there's nothing there, and you get there and there are these these double thickness hedgerows with marders and stuff inside it. So I think they may have given a bit of false hope on occasion to troops, because you can't rely entirely on aerial photos. You'd still need to do your ground reconnaissance patrols as well. You'd have to send out your 2-man teams at night to probe and look and what have you. But I think their value cannot be understated. It's incredible stuff. So Matt, I mean I know you're the Typhoon guy, but any pilot stories you know about reconnaissance guys?
One of the things that's always jumped out at me was the incredible men of 168 and 430 squadrons who flew Mustang 1s on the TAC-R missions on D-Day. Between those two squadrons, they flew, I've got it here, and I've just gone and lost it, 36 low-level tactical reconnaissance sorties over the beaches. And, for on the sort of fighters and the fighter bombers, there you go, there's one right there. Which you can tell it's a 1 with an Allison engine with the little nose on top.
I knew you were going to mention that one exactly. That's why I had that one ready. And no, that was complete luck.
Perfect. It's almost like we planned this.
Yeah.
But they're flying incredibly low to get very detailed pictures of what is going on just behind the beachheads. And I sometimes wonder, I don't have any proof, is maybe the sheer quantity of imagery that's coming in to make those quick decisions to get that information forward may have led to certain things not going to plan. But for the guys in those two squadrons, they were flying 2-3 times just on D-Day alone to get that imagery back. And at least one aircraft was shot down by friendly fire because they were flying not through the specific corridors of that the air bosses were expecting, because they were flying sort of across as opposed to in and into deep. So you can paint as many stripes as you like on an aircraft, but if you're under a lot of pressure and you see an airplane, everybody starts shooting at you, which is not ideal when you're at low level.
I just shared that map there. That's the air
great.
landing as air plan for June the 6th, and you can see those watching. You got the photo recce area right well beyond the beaches, to to give the information what's coming up behind. And it does just show the complication of the air operations on D-Day. And you've got your coastal command things up there, far, towards the Netherlands and Belgium, and over there, over above Brittany. Then you've got your fighter cover, your bomber cover. I'm going to bring up bombers fairly shortly with Sean's area of expertise. So the air operations, are vast, and we all know the basic figures. Was it 13,000 Allied aircraft in the skies on D-Day, something like that? And incredible. It's not the argument about whether or not it's air superiority or air supremacy. I think will carry on forever. I mean, it's somewhere between the two, possibly. What do we think? Is it air superiority or supremacy?
Supremacy.
Oh, supremacy without question.
Yeah. Okay. We're firmly in that camp, are we? Yeah. I mean, it's
superiority, unless you're 183 Squadron and you lose 3 aircraft FW190s on the day. They'd probably argue with you on that one.
Okay, so nearly superiority, but yeah. So, no, it's all good stuff. So the aerial reconnaissance. I mean, anyone else want to talk about aerial reconnaissance any more on that? I mean, I'm just checking. We got any questions coming in? That nothing.
Can I just jump in on one thing quickly?
Sure.
Going back to your question about how guys ended up with flying with photo recon units. I've actually got a family member that was photo recon pilot on Mosquitoes with 1 PIU, and he was shot. We're talking way before D-Day. Unfortunately he was shot down and killed in July 42 near Calais. But he was, as far as we can understand, the reason he ended up on a PIU was because he was borderline pacifist. So he wanted to fly. He wanted to serve, but he wanted to operate in a way where he wasn't necessarily taking a life. So flying a photo recon Mosquito was his way of doing that. I just wanted to throw that in there as a way of, that it's possible that maybe these guys had if they put a certain request in, that maybe they could serve with a certain unit, but who knows.
That's brilliant stuff, Adam. Thanks for sharing that. So, anyone got a subject they want to bring up? Is it me again? Shall I decide what we do next? Let's talk bombers. Let's talk the bombing on June the 6th, because there's various ways we could go off and tangents we could go on this that we will or will not do. I don't know. But Sean, I know you did this for our June the 6th show, but give a brief summary of the Bomber Command's role and on June the 6th itself.
Okay, so for Bomber Command specifically, you have Operation Titanic, the dropping of the Ruperts and that kind of thing. You have intercepting of German potential night fighter routes as well, and then, if arguably the main thing, if you like, was the bombing of coastal batteries, which is we spoke about on the 6th of June. So 10 had been listed as being significant threat enough to warrant their attentions. So some were attacked just around midnight. So Saint Martin de Varaville and Merville, because they were close to where paratroopers are going to be landing. The rest between about 3 and 5 o'clock in the morning. And that was their role for the morning of D-Day. Then it's back, but that was just D-Day. The next night, so on the night of the 6th, 7th of June, they're bombing the infrastructure, which brings you to the next kind of over Normandy main role of command, which is targeting towns and cities, crossroads, that kind of thing, which led to inevitable civilian loss of life, of course, and also the targeting of V weapon sites, which are outside Normandy by this time, because the ones in Normandy were, not being used. But they have to target the V weapon sites as well, because a week after D-Day, the Germans launched their V weapon offensive. 13th of June, the first one hit London. So that becomes their kind of, not priority, but a major thing. And then you have tactical support in terms of operations. So what's today, 29th? So tomorrow, 76 years ago, we have the bombing of Villers-Bocage to stop 2nd SS Panzer Corps en route to the front. Then you have support in Operation Charnwood a week or so later, and then Goodwood, and then Totalize. And you have, in a sense, a progression in terms of numbers. So the Villers-Bocage force was like 200 or something planes, and it kind of gets bigger for Charnwood, and then bigger still for Goodwood, and then total, I think it was over 1,000 aircraft in total. But also the level of control. So if we take Charnwood as an example, you know, the bombing of Caen was accurate in the sense that the bombs fell where they wanted them to, but maybe a little bit too close to the city rather than on German positions. By total lies, over just over 1,000 aircraft, only 660 actually dropped their payload, because, you know, they weren't happy that they were going to be doing the job well enough that they wanted to do. So you have this kind of learning process, if you like, where they're kind of refining. Unfortunately, the loss of civilian life continued. You know, the bombing of Le Havre, you know, the end of the Battle of Normandy, if you like, if you want to count that. There was, you know, more civilians died in the bombing of Le Havre than Germans. That's absolutely certain. But yeah, that's their role. So bombing of batteries first on D-Day, and then the infrastructure, and then tactical support in terms of specific operations.
We can draw a slight parallel with the troop carriers in that the Bomber Command on D-Day were doing a role they hadn't been doing that frequently before, had they? So they're doing something slightly different. I mean, when we bring in Matt on the 2nd Tactical Air Force, and indeed Mike, they're continuing something they've been sort of doing before. But the Bomber Command hitting individual gun batteries that are less than half a mile across is not something they've really done before, is it, Sean? So how much specialist training went into that?
Well, I mean, you know, it's they've been aiming at specific points before, you know, whether it be across, you know. So it's just, yeah, they and also, you know, if you're having 100 bombers bombing each of these 10 batteries, you know, if you throw 1,000 darts at a dartboard, one of them's probably going to hit the bullseye. So you have that kind of compensation factor, if you like.
Yeah.
You know, they're aiming at specific, like bridges and stuff. They've been bombing bridges and railway yards, and the railway yard is not that much bigger than a gun battery. So to a certain extent, they have some experience in precision bombing.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, maybe I'm thinking more of the 8th Air Force and the 9th Air Force difference. But Matt or Mike, we'll come back to bombers in a minute. Matt or Mike, let's run through, one of you, both of you, about 2nd Tactical Air Force's roles leading up to D-Day and then on D-Day. Then we can tackle beyond D-Day later on. So whichever one wants to go in first. You're both being very Canadian polite. No, well, not me. No, you go first. Go.
We're sort of looking at each other on the screen, smiling.
Well, I guess I'll chime in first
Mike.
here.
Good.
I think a really useful way to sort of organize the discussion is to go back and look at John Train, and he's the great RAF historian. He wrote The Right of the Line, A History of the RAF in the Second World War, which is sort of one of the go-to books in understanding anything about the RAF. And in his chapters on Normandy, he concluded it by saying that air power was the decisive factor in the Normandy campaign, which is a pretty broad-ranging statement to say that of all the things that were taking place in that campaign, whether it be the artillery, the infantry, the armor, the ability to supply the troops as they were needed, that air power was that factor that ultimately made the difference. And that's what he's brought to the debate. And I won't share my view on that right now, because I think it'll become apparent as we go on, and we can revisit it as we go through this. But that's kind of a useful yardstick when examining air power in the Normandy campaign, that at least one major commentator considers it as the decisive factor.
No, definitely. And I think we're all of us sitting here, I think, are fans of air power, and I think we'll do a future show about the Navy role on D-Day and Operation Overlord as well, because that's another misunderstood and undervalued, underappreciated aspect. But we're air power today. So Matt, that was a great point by Mike. Let's run through the role before D-Day and then on D-Day in your area of expertise.
So with the Typhoon force especially, you have what some historians have called the radar war. So for most of May, most of the Typhoon squadrons are going after the radar stations on the coast and communications just behind. And as we talked about on the D-Day stream itself, was you're by the 6th of June, the German radar coverage is down to sort of single-digit percentages, sort of 90 radar stations knocked out. And even on D-Day itself, there's still the ones that are still possibly active are being attacked by aircraft, especially further up the coast towards Dieppe and Calais. And this has been very attritional, especially for the Typhoons, who there were some in 2TAF who were wanting to keep them back for the support that they were going to come, but they were needed for what was considered a precision strike capability, something we're going to come back to later, I'm sure. And with this in place, the landings happen. The expectation is there's going to be a lot of call for air support close to the beach. And you've got the Canadian squadrons, the bomb fooms going in, attacking a few specific hard points behind Sword and Juno and Gold. But quite soon after that, the Typhoon squadrons have a bit of a lull. And it's not really till midday that they're finding that they're getting calls for targets. And by mid-afternoon, they're released into armed recces. So they're not even going through the expectations, the sort of famous cab rank that's been mentioned in many histories as well. So what their expectation is, and you read the ORBs and you read the diaries of the pilots, they were up at 3 o'clock in the morning, ready to go for this day of days. A number of squadrons had been operating on the 5th, so they knew what was happening. One wing commander famously radioed in to his guys who were coming back at low level on the 5th as they flew over the invasion fleet, saying, "None of you say a word, we'll talk about this when we land." And when they landed, they went, "You better go get some sleep, you're going to have a busy day tomorrow." And that's kind of what happened, except 3 squadrons were attacking from the moment that the troops were hitting the beaches at about 7 a.m. And then until about noon, they didn't have any calls. So they went to the secondary target list, which was crossroads, chateaus, anything that could be considered a point of communication hubs. And then after that, again, they weren't getting the calls from the beaches because they had naval support. So they were released onto armed recces, which was much further inland to the south of Caen. And instead of aircraft flying over with 8 rockets, they were carrying 4 with long-range tanks, and they were just looking for trouble, which is why they sort of ran into it with a number of cases of their aircraft being bounced, because they were flying much lower than the fighter cover, which was maybe 10 to 12,000 feet above them.
I mean, I think one of the fascinating things to me about the air power side of things is that the academic view, I think, is firmly in the, as Mike said a few minutes ago, that air power is the most significant factor in the Battle of Normandy. But it's not necessarily the popular layman's view. And I think my opinion for that is, just my own relatives who fought, is that you're having to deal with this idea that troops on the ground are thinking a lot of the time that the air power is not helping them and it's actually hindering them. And indeed, there's the blue on blue friendly fire thing and it comes in even 4 years earlier in Dunkirk, or the discussions of the film, which we won't go into, but this idea that the RAF weren't there. Well, because when you speak to the guys on the beaches, they didn't feel the RAF were there because the RAF were doing things elsewhere. They weren't doing things directly over the beaches. And I think the same thing kind of comes into Normandy, in that often the Allied air power is doing things beyond where troops on the ground can see its effect. And the effect they are seeing is often negative. Every American soldier in Normandy knows someone who was affected by the missed dropping of the bombs before Cobra, don't they? Everyone's got a brother or a cousin, or they've heard a rumor. And the same you could apply to British units as well. Oh, you hear about this guy over there. His own mob got dropped bombs on them by the Air Force last week. It seems to be a perception amongst the guys on the ground. So I think it's good if we can keep on this idea that the air power was a very significant factor. So I think, because we're going to bring it up sooner or later, before we go into more detail, the 2nd Tactical Air Force, 2TAF, however you want to call it, fighters, fighter bombers, and bombers. And we have bombers in other formations where we've got Bomber Command, and we've got the 8th Air Force and 9th Air Force. Who wants to be the one to break down the difference between fighters and fighter operations and fighter bombers and the other four, and indeed how those roles changed for the landings in Normandy? Because we are merging, we're creating a force to support the ground attacks. Mike's putting his hand up there. So a kind of layman's guide to the different types of role.
Yeah, just before we go on, if I may, I think what you were just touching on before about the roles of the Air Force is a really important one that is worth spending a few minutes talking about. I guess I need to be clear.
Your audio just went a bit funny, Mike.
Oh, sorry.
There you are, better now.
Yep. Better. I threw John Train up as a bit of a straw man because I don't agree that air power was the most significant factor in the Normandy campaign. I think it was very important. I think it was essential, but I think it was just one of many ways that the Allies brought their overwhelming firepower to bear on the battlefield. And I think you can see that in a few different ways. The point you make, though, about the Army and the Air Force having very different views of what tactical air power should be is a really important one and absolutely key to understanding what the Air Force was doing during the battle. If you cast back to the Mediterranean campaign, especially the Greek campaign and Crete, the RAF was really heavily criticized for not being there. That the British troops thought they were always being attacked by Stukas and low-flying Messerschmitts, and they kept saying, where was the RAF? They like to say that RAF didn't stand for Royal Air Force, it stood for Rare as Fairies, or Royal Absent Force, which really got across the idea that it wasn't where they thought it needed to be. But they didn't fundamentally understand what air power was doing. And to have aircraft over the troops, while it might have been a very good sop to their feelings and assuage them that the Air Force is doing its role, that's not what the Air Force should have been doing. The Air Force has a whole wide range of roles that go far beyond the immediate battlefront that the Army is concerned with. And whether that be doing interdiction, whether that be air superiority missions, whether it be reconnaissance, the vast majority of missions that the Air Force is doing are out of sight of the Army. But as far as the infantryman at the front is concerned, if I can't see that aircraft, it's not doing anything useful for me. And that's a big problem from their point of view, but it doesn't understand what air power does. And I think it's really important to understand what tactical air power was supposed to do. The Americans had a really good way of delineating the roles of tactical air power, and they called it a three-phase procedure. The first phase was air superiority. Tactical air power can do absolutely nothing unless you have air superiority. Because if we have to operate in a situation where the enemy is on the battlefield, we're going to have trouble. So the first thing you have to achieve is air superiority. Second thing is armed reconnaissance of interdiction, acting to prevent the enemy from getting to the battlefield. So that might mean ranging far beyond the battlefront to attack trains, convoys, bridges, marshalling yards, everything that the enemy is using to bring his combat power to the front. That's the second priority of the tactical air forces. The third priority is close air support or attacks on targets in the immediate battlefield, which is what targets that needed to be attacked that were very difficult to find, and even if found, were even more difficult to hit. So I think that's a really important distinction, and we can go into a little bit more detail and about what air power could do, couldn't do, had trouble doing as the conversation goes on.
And I think that third factor you said, that's the one that is the infantry on the ground are seeing the most of, and therefore not seeing perhaps the best of the air power. They're seeing that the things they're doing hastily, that there's not their natural talent. You know, I mean, if you're an infantryman on the ground in the Green Howards or something, and you see 3 Panzer IVs coming bearing down you, what you may not know is that there could have been another 7, but those other 7 have run out of fuel because the fuel barrels have been hit 60 miles away by a strafing Spitfires or something. So, but that's irrelevant to you. You've still got 3 Panzer IVs bearing down you, so you're not seeing the results of what's happened before you go. So so again, well, let's that was brilliant stuff. Let's break down. So within those three tasks, how do the different types of aircraft fit in? Who wants to take that one? Matt, do you want to do a bit about the roles of the different aircraft?
Sure. And this is where things get murky because you've got the same name of aircraft doing different sort of roles.
Indeed.
Well, let's Mike, jump in here and correct me when I'm bound to get some of this wrong. But if you take the Spitfire, you've essentially got the sort of the main marks in action. You've got the Spitfire 9, but then the Spitfire 9 has the HF and the LF version, one for high altitude and one for low altitude. So you've got top cover fighters, and then you have the Spitfire 9 LFs, which can carry bombs, numbers of rockets, so they're technically fighter bombers. But again, their performance window is more as fighter. Throw in to that sort of borderline mix, and you can make the argument, and we were talking about Chris Evans's thesis earlier, that the pure fighter bomber doesn't necessarily exist yet, because all the aircraft that are doing that role started out as a pure fighter. So whether it's P-47 or the Typhoon, it's something that developed into something that was had a strike capability. So where sort of my love for this comes in with the Typhoon is you've got an aircraft which fails as a high altitude interceptor, but because of those failures, it works very well at low level and has a tendency to soak up quite a bit of punishment. It's to counter two myths quickly. The engine did not always burst into flames and the tail did not always fall off. But that's another story. And again, you've got an aircraft which finds its niche in something that it's not designed for. So it's not a pure fighter bomber. And then throw into the mix on the more bomber end, you've got the Mosquitoes, which start out as a bomber, can become a fighter, and by this point are doing the same sort of jack of all trade roles. And then more into the pure bombers, you're bringing in your Mitchells, your Bostons, and your what you consider a medium bomber for a tactical role, which 9th and 2TAF would be deploying in greater numbers as this went on. And then just to confuse things, when the escort fighters weren't available for the mediums, you'd have the Typhoon squadrons called up to remove their rocket and bomb rails and escort the medium bombers. So there's not really a clear delineation between any of the types. They're being used in multiple roles. And that's why it always makes things a little bit more tricky, because people like things to be in their nice little boxes so that you can just tell one story.
Well, that's our flexibility, isn't it? That's our several years of doing this and gradually tweaking and adjusting and pushing and getting these individual aircraft into the roles that they are very good at. And one could argue, I think, that the Germans have got, they're rather square peg, square hole. But I don't know. It's a lots of variables we can discuss here. And Sean, bombers. The Bomber Command, we covered that a little bit. Do you want to talk a little bit about the 8th Air Force and the 9th Air Force from the US point of view? Just briefly explain the difference for people who are watching and what they're doing in basic terms.
Yeah, so 9th Air Force is basically smaller aircraft, single and twin engines, and 8th Air Force in terms of bombers, twin engine bombers, and then the 8th Air Force tends to be the B-24s and the B-17s, so doing the kind of the heavier work, if you like. Similar role we mentioned with Bomber Command, infrastructure targets, that kind of thing. Can I just pick you up on something about the Germans, because they adapted their aircraft in exactly the same way that we did. So aircraft would start off
fine, yeah,
and they did the same thing. So the because 88 is an example, starts off as a bomber, ends up as a reasonably effective night fighter. So
that's a very good point. Yeah.
So the 8th Air Force, then you've got the heavy bombers and their escorts, and then 9th would be the B-25s, B-26s as well, that kind of thing, the twin engine bombers, doing the more precise stuff. But I was going to mention something earlier about precision as well. Just 2 days after D-Day, one of the targets for Bomber Command was a tunnel, just a railway tunnel, which is quite precise. And going back to what you mentioned, that tunnel blocked, it was a railway tunnel, blocked the 17th SS Division, or partly, but not a single American soldier who fought around Carenton had any awareness of that. So it goes back to exactly what you were saying. This stuff
very good point.
Has an impact which is beyond the scope of the guys on the ground and what they can see and what they can understand.
Yeah, and I think as well. Then that's that thing that Adam was talking earlier on about authors like Stephen Ambrose admitting that they only interview what I call the sexy veterans, you know, the Rangers and the paratroopers and the guys on the ground, the lieutenants and the in leading platoons, and not speaking to the guys in the perhaps from their point of view, the duller jobs, you know. And but it's all fascinating stuff. And so I think we've possibly got all the introduction over and done within an hour and 10 minutes. I think we can kind of go a little bit more geeky now, possibly. And in order to kind of control where we're going with this, I think we need to kind of get some more structure involved. Mike's been very good and professional. He's the one bringing it back on course, because I'm just wittering on like an idiot often. But I do that quite well, I think. So as the Normandy campaign progresses, we've touched on the Matt gave us the idea, the differing roles of the aircraft and you know, Spitfire Mark 9. What are we learning within the first week or two of the Normandy campaign, and how are we implementing changes to things? Because we're everything's going a bit different to plan, because the Normandy campaign on the ground, D-Day was a great success, but things are now got a bit stagnated, and we're not making the gains for Caen and Saint-Lô that we perhaps were expecting. So how are the air forces adapting to the things on the ground? What changes are being made? Who would like to come in and leap in on talk about that? And Adam will bring you in on troop carrier. In fact, let's bring Adam in now. He's been sitting there patiently. Let's bring out Adam a little bit about the troop carrier role after D-Day, because I think that's lesser known. What are all those, the units you've written about, what are they doing in the next few weeks?
Well, obviously, we spoke about, well, Matt and Sean spoke about the flexibility of aircraft, and one of the most flexible aircraft that operated during the war was the C-47. Basically, obviously, one of the key primary roles that they performed was flying supplies to the front lines. And then what they would do was they would unload their aircraft, and then they would fly wounded soldiers back to the UK. Those that had wounds of a particular nature or were more critical could be flown back a lot more hastily than they might otherwise be taken back on a hospital ship, for example. So the troop carrier units would fly to an airfield, predominantly one from the 53rd Wing that had a quartermaster unit stationed with it, and depending on what the requirements were, they would fly supplies to improvised or advanced landing grounds that had been built inland of beaches or just behind the front lines. I did a thread on Twitter a week or two ago about the most important of those, which was what the troop carrier and the transport squadrons referred to as milk runs, which was flying whole or dried blood supplies to the front lines, which the troop carrier crews basically referred to as their most important cargo, aside from anybody from a human cargo, basically. And the reason was that the whole blood supplies were taken straight to the field hospitals for treating wounded soldiers, and the dried blood supplies, which was essentially blood plasma, was issued to frontline medics so that they could administer the plasma to wounded soldiers on the front line, which alleviated the effects of shock and saved untold thousands of lives on the ground in Normandy, and obviously the subsequent campaigns. A number of the troop carrier groups had medical air evacuation squadrons assigned to their airfields. So they had around 50 nurses on station, which meant that when the supply flights went into Normandy, they almost always carried a nurse on board the aircraft. And the moment the cargo hold of the aircraft was emptied, it was repurposed to carry wounded personnel. So a medical officer on the ground at one of the airfields would prepare wounded soldiers to be boarded onto the aircraft, and he would brief nurses on the aircraft as to the nature of their wounds, so she could decide whether or not they had to be litter bound or whether they could be seated, and then they would fly back to the UK, again to a station that was reasonably close to one of the many American general hospitals that had been built in the UK. So the idea was that the aircraft were never flying to or from Normandy empty. They were either flying with supplies and flying back with wounded soldiers, or they were always being used for something. So the supply flight started pretty soon after the advanced landing grounds were built. And I believe the first proper evacuation flights of wounded personnel was around the 19th of June. And they were daily. They were every day, as long as the weather was okay. You know, they were in and out every day. And that was their job until such time as some high-ranking general somewhere came along and said, we need you to drop more paratroopers somewhere. That was what they did.
Well, that's fantastic stuff, Adam. I mean, I think people watching this will appreciate that they've learned something there, because, you know, bringing blood in is very important. And it also, I think, shows how we have an ability as the allies to do something. It's not a luxury saving lives, but in warfare, it's not a priority. There are nations just trying to stop themselves from being killed. If we have the ability to bring blood in and supplies back and forth with troop carriers, it shows that we've got a expanse of wealth behind us that is enabling us to do stuff that our enemy could possibly only dream of at that point of view. And it's also streamlining, you know, getting rid of very seriously wounded people out of hospitals is streamlining the hospital, isn't it? It's not only saving that life, it is improving the efficiency of that ground hospital, which enables them to deal with the other lighter cases more readily and more swiftly. So it's a very important thing, I think, that we've covered there. So thank you very much for that, Adam. But in general terms, let's bring back to Mike and Matt and Sean again. So within a week of D-Day, things haven't progressed as much. What changes are being made at the planning level to improve things? Mike's put his hand up again. He's very good, Mike. I like Mike. He's coming back again. He's a regular.
Yeah, it's really important to understand there's a big tension between the Army and the RAF during the entire war. Well, I mean, it goes back to the first.
A bit of bandwidth issue there, I think. Mike's breaking up a little bit. Can anyone else hear Mike?
Sorry,
No,
are we okay now?
Yeah, okay now, yeah.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I don't know why I've got a.
No, that was
bandwidth,
not your microphone that time. It just was not. I was getting nothing.
All right. Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed. It
All
keeps
good
going
now.
smoothly. But the entire debate between the RAF and the Army, going back to the start of the war, is what the role of the RAF is going to be. And the Army wants to control the RAF. They want to essentially treat the Air Force as if it's an adjunct arm, very much like the artillery. So the Army can say, we want you to target this, go do it. And the Air Force will just say, yes, sir, we'll go do it right away. And obviously the RAF has a very different view. They understand that their focus isn't just on the battlefront, it's much more wide ranging. And by the end of the Battle of North Africa, this had essentially been decided, and the RAF had established that it was going to control its own missions and everything like that. It's interesting to see that once you get into Normandy, everything starts very centralized. The RAF controls missions, they control targeting, they control the dispatch of aircraft. But as the Normandy campaign goes on, it becomes much more decentralized, exactly what they'd been fighting against all through the Battle of France in 1940 and the Western Desert and North Africa and Italy. But there's a bunch of factors at play. One is that there's so many more aircraft at play in Normandy than has ever been the case before, that the RAF can do, well, the RAF and the US Army Air Forces can do everything they've always wanted to do in terms of air superiority, in terms of armed recce and interdiction, that they still have enough aircraft left to give to the Army to play with. And probably the best example of that is the American example known as armored column cover, where they start working very closely with the US armored divisions right after the Cobra breakout at the beginning of August. And what you see there is an experienced fighter pilot, a P-47 pilot, who is plucked out of his cockpit and plunked down into the turret of a Sherman tank, and is with an armored column at the advance point. And he's got a VHF radio that allows him to talk to the aircraft right up above him. So a flight of 4 or 8 or 12 Thunderbolts are delegated right to that armored column as it advances. And the pilot in the tank can then say, hey, Joe, we've got a German roadblock up ahead. Can you see it? Yes, we can see it. And they go down and attack it. And it was very successful, very effective use of air power. Problem was, it's incredibly expensive in terms of the amount of resources it used. So unless you have hundreds, thousands of aircraft to be able to send on different missions, you can't do that. Before Normandy, it wasn't possible. In Normandy, it was. And the British are doing a similar thing with their visual control posts, the cab rank, which comes in later in the campaign as well. Not quite as effective as what the Americans were doing, but it shows that further decentralization of the control of the air resource.
Brilliant stuff. Matt, do you want to jump in on that, or Sean's? I'll put Sean on. This is we're all lead.
I was just going to mention this specifically as a guy, Gordon Cowans, Robin Cowans, sorry, who was with many years ago, and his job, he was an army officer, and he was then assigned to the Royal Air Force to learn about what they could do. You know, what were the limitations, what were the, you know, what they could and couldn't do. So when he went back to an infantry battalion, he could then pass on the information. And when somebody requested air cover for this or some, you know, some support for this, he would know instinctively whether it was feasible or not. So you had that level, you know, like translating the Army's instructions to something which the Air Force could understand and actually carry out. Does that make sense?
No, it does. And I remember that story of Major Howie in the 29th Division. Wasn't it about a week or two after D-Day? He either took some of his officers from his battalion to go and meet some of the air crews on the ground, or he invited some of the air crews to go and visit his unit. One or the other. It doesn't make much difference. But basically, some infantry lieutenants met some pilot lieutenants and captains, and they just said, "So what are you doing day to day then? What are your jobs?" They just spent an evening having a couple of beers together, and they came out of it with an understanding of what each other expected of them and what was possible and what wasn't possible. But I wonder how much of that stuff was happening kind of improvised and how much of it was happening at a higher level, because, you know, Mike said there's an awful lot of moving parts. There's an awful lot of aircraft alone coordinating all these different roles. It's a massive, great task, and developing new techniques. The battle is moving very fast, and new techniques coming in. And by the time you've got them, everybody understanding how they're going to work, is a lot of stuff to cover. So, Matt, in terms of Typhoons, what were the first things that the pilots were noticing when they began the Normandy operations beyond D-Day? Was it as they were expected, or were they having to change and adapt quickly? Give me an idea of what was happening.
They encountered a number of problems to start with. So one is the age-old problem of flying at 350 miles an hour, trying to find a single point on a map marked by smoke when everything is covered in smoke, which comes up time and time again, which is there's a lot of talk in histories about the aircraft flying cab ranks, where they were just basically stacked up waiting to be called in. It's a little bit blown out of proportion, but you'd have sections of aircraft called into a point on a map by the forward air controller. The Army would fire some smoke at a target while continuing to fire at the target. And then the Typhoons would call in and then roll in and attack where that smoke landed. And then you have all the problems of attacking a target while you're being shot at with unguided weapons, and it gets all a little bit tricky. Added to all of this, you've got Flak, which I think we're going to come back to in a minute.
Yeah, we'll do Flak in a minute. Yeah.
But the most unexpected thing that the Typhoons came up against from the 14th of June onwards was dust. So all of the advanced landing grounds were built very quickly. Farmlands were just, the tops were bulldozed, matting put down, and they were essentially operational. But the one thing about Normandy, which goes back all the way to Agincourt, is that the soil is very unique. And in the heat of a summer, it just became dust. And the Typhoons themselves, being a very fine bit of machinery, couldn't cope with it. So the dust was actually causing the engines to eat themselves. So they would fly over in the morning, refuel, rearm at the advanced landing ground, take off, throw up huge plumes of dust, and then within a day or two, they'd need an engine change, because it was just literally rotting the inside of the engines, this fine, coarse Norman dust. So it was immediately identified that it needed a filter. So within a few days, an air filter was designed and bolted onto the front of the engine, which unfortunately looked a bit like a mushroom. And the Sabre had a nasty habit of backfiring. So what would happen is they'd start up this 36-liter, 24-cylinder engine. It would backfire and it would fire this sort of mushroom dome air filter across the airfield, causing all kinds of hell corruption and sharp words from the Irks who are trying to get these things going. And then basically within a week, Napier's and English Electric had completely redesigned that to having a little door that opened and closed. So by about the 20th of June, they could operate from the dust with no problems. And this just goes to show the amazing prowess of the manufacturing and design that the Allies had. For, not only could they have enough engines to swap them out after a couple of days of service, within a week, they completely overcome this dust problem. So when you look into some of the histories of 2 Tactical Air Force, Thomas and Shore's books make much of the dust problem, but it was rectified within a week, and they could get back to the sort of nitty gritty of trying to figure out how to make this support tell with the ground forces, which Mike explained really, really clearly a minute ago.
I mean, that's great stuff, and that's exactly the speed we can cure problems is amazing back then. And okay, we perhaps don't cure every one of them, but the fact we can identify a problem and cure it within 2 weeks is amazing. Mike's bound to come in, and so let's talk about the Royal Canadian Air Force, and they're not here as a separate formation. It's always in tandem with the Royal Air Force. But what as a Canadian, what improvements are being made, perhaps with the Spitfire squadrons in Normandy? What problems are they facing as they get there, and how are they, in a similar to Matt's explanation, what things are they doing to improve the situation as the couple of weeks after D-Day pass?
Yeah, I think it's really impressive to look at the expansion of the RCAF in the Second World War. They went from a pre-war force of just a few squadrons and very few modern aircraft to an absolutely enormous force by Canadian standards, over 40 squadrons overseas by 1944, and the vast majority of them, something like 37 of those squadrons, were involved in the Normandy campaign. So to be able to go from almost nothing to making a major contribution in a few short years is pretty impressive. And backing all that is the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which was one of the Canadians' biggest contributions to the Second World War in terms of training air crew, pilots, bombardiers, navigators, air gunners, and something like that. I'm not sure the exact numbers, but it was something like 130,000 men were trained for aviation careers during the war, which is a really impressive accomplishment. 83 Group, 2nd Tactical Air Force was composed of 3 groups. 83 and 84 Group were the composite groups and sort of the main striking force of 2 TAF. And 83 Group was the main Canadian force, and it had the spearhead role on D-Day. It was supporting 2nd British Army. If you go back, and Mark Milner talks about this really well, 1st Canadian Army was originally supposed to be the spearhead for the D-Day operation, and it was going to be supported by the Canadian 83 Group. But at some point, 1st Canadian Army was plucked out, 2nd British Army was brought in, but 83 Group stayed with the British, so that they'd been trained, prepared, given the aircraft to lead the D-Day assault. So that wasn't changed, and it leads to this odd situation where you have Canadian squadrons supporting British units in Normandy, and once 1st Canadian Army was activated in August, you have 84 Group, which was primarily British, supporting it, but it goes to that D-Day role. But the Canadians had 5 wings in Normandy. There was 3 Spitfire wings, there was a Typhoon wing, and there was a reconnaissance wing, all making a very big contribution to what was taking place. There's just before I go, there's just a great quotation from Hugh Godfroy, who was a Canadian wing commander, and he said he was talking to a captured German Luftwaffe pilot who was talking about the comparison between British and Commonwealth pilots, and he said British pilots were very predictable, they were very good, but you kind of knew what they were going to do. he said Commonwealth pilots and Canadians especially, you didn't have a freaking clue what they were going to be doing because they'd never do the same thing twice. So they were much more difficult to fight against. So whether that's true or apocryphal, I think it's a great story.
Well, one of my, I think I've told this story before. One of my cousin once removed was RAF ground crew in England, and there was a I was a very young kid when he told me this story. There were 3 squadrons in the group he was working with, 2 British and 1 Australian. And he said, I hated those bloody Australians. I said, why? He said, because they flew so fucking low, they came back with bits of church towers in the undercarriage and bird's nest. I mean, I'm sure it was a slight exaggeration, but he swears blind one day a Lancaster came back and there was actually a bird's nest lodged somewhere underneath the aircraft that it had picked up on a tree. And he said the British guys were great, but they flew that much more high off the ground and therefore didn't give us the same burden of maintenance on the underside of the aircraft. So that's what he always used to say. That was Bill Bacon used to say that, I think. Anyway, so we're an hour and a half in. Let's get really exciting with some of the really cool stuff and bust a few myths. And we can go back to another subject later on. So let's go round one by one and bust some myths for people watching this the things that people think are true about the Normandy Airpower that maybe aren't. Let's start with the one. There were no German aircraft on D-Day. And well, apart from the 2 you see in The Longest Day, Pips Priller and his mate flying down over Golden Juno. Who would like to take on? Let's bring in Sean about this. There were no German aircraft on D-Day. It's not true, is it, Sean?
No, there was about 300 or so. So yeah, quite a few during the day and the night. So from the early hours, there were reconnaissance missions sent up from Luftwaffe 10, who were actually a hit and run unit. They used to fly over England, drop kind of bombs, like single seat fighters. Carrying a football for 90s carrying bombs, but they were sent up to investigate what was going on. And then, once the invasion is confirmed, there's a guy, Helmut Eberspacher, I think I mentioned on the 6th of June, when he got back to his base, they phoned through to Luftwaffe 3 headquarters in Paris and said Eberspacher's seen them, which was like the confirmation from a reliable witness that the invasion was now underway. And of course, then they started getting in gear. And yeah, you had various fighter squadrons involved, and then during the night you have bomber squadrons coming up. With the bomber squadrons for the Germans, there's a bit of a problem. So if you take 3 Grouper from Kampfgeschwader 100, they were based in Toulouse. That's about 450 miles. It's like flying from where I am now in Normandy to Scotland.
Yeah,
that's their that's where they have to come from, because all the bases within range of Normandy have been eliminated. So they're having to fly up from the south or from elsewhere. That sort of thing, though. So yeah, there were plenty. There were more than 2, certainly. That's beyond doubt. And as Matt will no doubt chip in, there was they weren't just hanging around either. They were shooting down. Yeah.
And I realise we should have gone back and done Flak. Whether we can do Flak as part of the myths, but I think in when we talked about air superiority earlier, Flak is still an issue, regardless of whether we've got control of the skies. There's still lots of metal being flung up from the ground. All our air power on D-Day, and Adam talked earlier about the problem the troop carriers are facing, but Flak was a problem all over Normandy. You pretty much don't get a Widerstandsnest in Normandy without some kind of anti-aircraft capability. You get very few German forces on the ground mobile without some form of anti-aircraft ability. And who'd like to take that as a sub? I mean, I don't know what the data is myself, but in the course of air operations in Normandy, how many aircraft are we losing to ground fire? Does anyone know any figures for anyone? Matt's going to put his hand up. Brilliant.
I can only talk Typhoons because I actually have.
Of course, you're going to talk Typhoons. That's
yeah. But what else is there to talk about? They're fantastic. If I just sort of bring up some numbers here, you're looking on the whole. Of all the Typhoon losses, so you lose 249 Typhoons between D-Day and the liberation of Paris. And of that, 57% of that is just pure Flak. Right. So that is a grand total of 149 of those aircraft. Throw into that, you've got a few sort of collisions, because that happens, a couple engine failures, very few actually getting shot down, only about 20. Which, when you would consider sort of a 90 day campaign, that's quite low. But Flak is this brutal killer. All the accounts you read, they talk about Flak, and it's, you know, I think the thing we've talked about before, it's, you know, everyone talks about an 88 in Normandy. When we talk about sort of Flak here, we're talking light and medium, so 20, 30, 40 millimeter stuff that's coming at you at great amounts at incredibly high velocity, and has a nasty habit of exploding when it hits you. And if you're in a dive coming down from 8,000 feet, they kind of know where you're going. So they can take a bead on you and fire it up. I think Harry Hardy famously said it was like watching footballs come at you. If they were moving slowly, you were okay. And it was as soon as they sped up, you know, you had to jink the aircraft. And he said they were lazy, coming up like a slow firework. And that was just the ones you could see. It was the 20 or 30 rounds between each of the tracer that were the ones that were going to get you.
Wow. Does anyone, Adam, I mean, with all your troop carrier aircrew reports, any stories about Flak? Well, obviously,
yeah, I mean,
but any you want to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about it earlier, actually, that the 53rd Troop Carrier Wing, which was one of the wings that was responsible for dropping the 101st Airborne, they were quite good at making statistics about the damage that was sustained by aircraft when they returned from the Albany mission, the mission to drop the paratroopers over Normandy, and just to give you, I mean, one of the things that people think about in terms of Flak, or the you know, the effect that Flak could have is, you know, you talk about, like Matt was talking about, anything from 20 mil upwards is what's bringing aircraft down. Well, actually, looking at the statistical data from the troop carrier groups, the really devastating stuff was actually small arms fire. You know, things that was, you know, rounds fired from machine guns, on, you know, even rifle fire. You know, on an aircraft that's flying as slowly as a C-47 is on D-Day, you know, you get, you know, one of these rounds enters an aircraft at the wrong point and it can bring an aircraft down. You know, an engine, you know, a flight control cable, a fuel line, something like that on an aircraft of that type, and flying at the height it's at, it can be particularly devastating. So, whilst the Germans have obviously got this repertoire of seemingly excellent Flak guns of varying caliber, you know, actually the lighter stuff can, to certain aircraft anyway, can be just as dangerous. And it gives you an idea of just the, you know, from an aircrew's point of view, or a pilot's point of view, or you know, it just gives you an idea of just how hairy it is actually being in the air above German territory. You know, and it gives you an idea of, you know, just how easy it could be to bring an aircraft down if you hit it in the right spot. So on the night of D-Day, we're talking about, I keep calling it the night. On the morning of D-Day, we're talking about, we were talking earlier about how the 438th Troop Carrier Group, which was the first group over Normandy in the main serials flying the 101st Airborne Division, the first 3 squadrons, their aircraft returned with no damage at all. The fourth one returns with 3 aircraft damaged, and it's only really light damage, small arms fire. So we spoke about the possibility that the Germans are not quite fully alert to what's going on, and they're not necessarily looking to target the aircraft. We want to, in the future, look at the possibility that there's a middle sort of area where the Flak is more intense. And the reason is that the Germans are, well, we think the reason is the Germans are becoming more alert to the fact that there's an airborne operation taking place. They're starting to target the aircraft in the air. And then towards the latter part of the American serials coming over, that seems to die down. And we think that there's a possibility, I don't know whether or not any of the guys would be willing to weigh in on this, but the Germans are at that point becoming more preoccupied with what's going on the ground. With the airborne on the ground, they're starting to focus more of their attention on engaging the American airborne forces that are actually on the ground, as opposed to what's in the air. So yeah, I mean that's where we've been looking in terms of the effect of Flak with the troop carrier guys.
It could also be an ammo issue, just you know, conserve if you've in that middle period you talked about, which is amazing. If you're doing this new research, they may be expanding quite a lot of rounds, and then thinking, hang on, this is still going on. Maybe we should slow the rate of fire down a bit. I don't know. What does Sean and Matt think about that? Is that Does that make sense?
It makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the
Adam,
other things. Sorry.
Can I ask Adam? Yeah. Are there any losses of C4 that weren't Flak? Or were they all Flak?
There was, off the top of my head, there was one aircraft, a Pathfinder aircraft, I believe, which ditched in the channel on the way. I can't quite recall what the cause of that was. But generally, I think there are 21 aircraft lost, and I think they were all Flak.
Yeah.
I certainly can't recall any, but with technical errors.
I think it's the same with the British as well, the 6 Airborne.
Yeah, seems to ring a bell with me. Yeah, it was all Flak, wasn't it? I think there were some engine failures. There were some turnbacks just off the airfield, weren't there? But that was not damage from enemy fire. But yeah, no. So Flak. I mean, and the other thing about Flak is, and I think Matt, you talked about on June the 6th as well. You know, when you're flying in on a dive bombing on a target, or the same would apply to a troop carrier flying on a straight line. There's not a lot you can do about Flak at that point, is there? There's a certain point in that when you're in so far now, it's just get the job done and hope for the best, and that's something that's very scary. I think, go flying in and getting shot at from the ground. Myths. We did. Who wants to do a myth now? Then who wants to take on a myth? We've done German Air Force. Mike, do you want to do a myth? What myth would you like to dispel tonight, sir? Come on, let's throw one in the pot here.
Well, let's take a sideways shot at Matt about the Typhoon, and I'll
have a go at Matt. I'm on board with that. Yeah, he can take it.
I'm sitting up now, Mike.
Yeah, I'll preface this by saying the Typhoon is one of my favorite aircraft of the Second World War, and I mean everybody knows that it's known as the tank buster and was famous for its role in close air support. But operational research, which was a way of using scientific method to examine the results of operations, found that the Typhoon wasn't a very effective close air support aircraft. There's a whole series of reports that look at the effectiveness of not just Typhoons, but fighter bombers in general in being able to target the kind of objectives that the Army wants them to get: gun batteries, tanks, small batteries, things like that. And they show over and over again that the fighter bomber is a very imprecise weapon. Remember, this is way before the days of precision guided munitions and laser targeting and everything like that. A lot of the tactics had to be aimed by, well, I can say by guess and by golly. There's a great quote, and let's see if I can find it quickly, about how what was involved in trying to drop a rocket projectile. And the rocket projectiles were very effective when they hit a German target. Each Typhoon could carry up to 8 of these rockets, and it's been made equivalent to sort of a broadside from an 8-inch gun cruiser firing all 8 rockets. And it was very clear that one rocket could easily destroy any German tank, even a Tiger tank, with a direct hit. But the problem was hitting them, and the statistics are pretty grim. That let me just find those stats so I can give you the exact numbers. There was a study done just before Normandy, and they found that to hit a target the size of a barn would require 7 rocket projectiles for a 50% chance of a hit. To hit a large gun position, something about 10 meters in diameter, would require 88 rocket projectiles, 11 aircraft sorties for a 50% chance of a hit. And to hit the Army's favorite target, a Panther tank, would require something in the order of 140 rocket projectiles or 18 sorties of aircraft for a 50% chance of a hit. So it was very difficult to hit these targets. And then the whole question of finding them is a whole different story. And I have a neat little anecdote. Probably about 15 years ago, I was over in Normandy, and I had to take some photographs of the battlefields for a book I was working on. So I'd rented a flight in a Cessna 172, and we took off from Carpiquet Airport. And as soon as we took off, it was really easy to landmark where we were and where we were going. It was a summer afternoon, late afternoon, not a cloud in the sky. So we took off, and I could see the Conbaya highway, and I could see Caen off to my right, the east, and Baya to the left. I could see the D-Day beaches right in front of us. So we flew up to Arromanches and overflew the remains of the Mulberry Harbor. It was really easy to find. We flew over Gold, and then Juno, and finally Sword Beach, and then turned right and flew down the canal. Really easy to shoot all the villages and towns that I wanted to photograph. Flew over Caen itself. Once again, still knew exactly where we were. But then we got over Verrières Ridge, which are the big open fields south of Caen. And all of a sudden we had a real hard trouble trying to find what we wanted. I wanted to take a picture of Verrières Village, where the Canadians had a series of nasty battles in late July, and finally found it. The next thing I wanted to take a picture of was the Canadian cemetery at Bretteville. And looked for a little bit, and we saw the cemetery, so we made a beeline for it and started circling it. And I quickly realized that no, we'd missed the Canadian cemetery, and we'd carried on further south, and we were over the Polish cemetery, which is a few miles south. So we had to circle back and go there, back to the Canadian cemetery. And a reminder, we're flying low, we're flying slow, we have no clouds, we're much slower than a Typhoon or a Spitfire. And then the next objective was to go down to the Falaise Pocket, and I especially wanted a photograph of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives, which is the spot where Major David Curry was awarded the Victoria Cross for his fight stopping the Germans fleeing the Falaise Pocket. And we could not find Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives to save our lives. And my pilot was a local. His home airdrome was actually the Falaise airdrome. So he's in his own backyard, and we can't find Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives to save our lives. We finally find it when he's on the radio, and he talked to a buddy of his who happened to be in the air. And excuse me, this guy came flying, zooming in over top of us, and we played follow the leader to Saint-Lambert until we finally found it. And it really gave me a new appreciation of the troubles that the fighter pilots would have faced during the Normandy campaign, because we were flying at about half the speed of a standard attack. We were well below 10,000 feet. There was no clouds, there was no smoke, the weather was perfect, and nobody was firing at us. Yet we still couldn't find something the size of a town as an objective, let alone something smaller like a gun battery or a Panther tank or something. So yeah, it really put it into perspective, the troubles these pilots had, and the fact that they had any success at all is really a credit to their skills.
Well, I think that comes back to the familiarity idea we talked about earlier. And if you do something regularly, you get good at it. Now, while you were talking about your flight from Carpiquet, Adam Lunny, who's still watching, talking about the flight he took from Carpiquet, and I've taken a flight from Carpiquet, and Mag, my other half, has taken a flight from Carpiquet, and they do that same loop. They do what the loop you did, which is along the Conbaya highway up towards Arromanches, back along Gold, Juno, Sword, is the loop they do however many times a week. So of course, and they're good at it. And of course, navigate when you've got the sea and the land, it's a really good navigation hint, isn't it?
Yeah,
I can completely see once you start going south of Caen, you've got those various arterial roads that come out of Caen. Is that the one to Falaise, or is that the one to so-and-so? And it can all start looking very, very similar, even on boat trips. I know that's irrelevant. I've done a couple of boat trips along Omaha Beach, and I'm going, so where's F1 draw coming up? And you realize you've missed it, something you've gone to day in, day out for years, and you're looking at it from a slightly different angle. And you have to, and I had, and both boat trips I did, I saw it on the way back. I'd missed it on the way out, and I thought, right, on the way back, I'm going to make sure I get it. So I can completely get the difficulty of navigation. I threw up while Mike was talking there, the painting. I'll show it one more time. I just found this. I don't know who painted that one there. It's one of those typical images that you can buy online of a couple of Tiffies flying over Normandy there. And that one's all still got its rockets on board, which seems a bit strange. And there's two Panther tanks burning down there, implying that that Typhoon, or the one behind it, has already knocked out a couple of Panthers. And you know, as we said, that's bollocks. 4% or something of the targets on the ground were taken, the tanks were taken out by the air. But we cannot talk about the effect without talking about the psychological effect on the Germans and the taking out of the transport and supply arm of the tank units. It's very difficult to hit single Panthers, but you can maybe hit a nice slow moving column of fuel Bowsers coming up, or the soft skin, or the repair vehicles, or you can hit those kind of things. and the psychological effect. I mean, you've only got to pick up any account by a German soldier in Normandy, and the talk about the Yabos, the fighter bombers, be it Typhoons, Mustangs, or Thunderbolts. The terrifying fear of that was just there, and yet most Germans killed by something from the air are probably going to be hit by artillery, aren't they? That's probably but artillery doesn't have the same fear factor.
Yeah, and there's a couple of really excellent operational research reports about the attack on Mortain, the so-called Day of the Typhoon.
Yeah.
And the OR teams went in after the battle to count what had been destroyed and try to figure out if these tanks had been destroyed by Typhoons or Thunderbolts or by artillery or anti-tank guns. And they found very few tanks had actually been destroyed by air power. They made a kind of curious discovery that a number of tanks had been abandoned in seeming running order, seemed to be in good order, didn't seem to be hit, had fuel, and they'd kind of concluded that the German crews had run away because they'd been scared about the attacks by the Typhoons. But as the report noted, it said that probably the safest place for those German tank crews during an attack by Typhoons was right inside their own tank.
Stay inside, yeah. I mean, Sean, you live further south than me. You're in that kind of Coutances area, so you're in the Cobra, Mortain kind of area more than me. I mean, Mike's absolutely right, isn't he? The artillery is the predominant factor in knocking out most German vehicles, isn't it? Really, but the air power is a psychological weapon, isn't it? I mean, you've read a lot of German accounts, so the Germans are terrified of them, aren't they? I mean, absolutely.
Yeah, going back to the accuracy thing, it doesn't really matter to a certain extent how accurate one rocket is against one tank. I say tanks aren't their only target. Like you mentioned, you've got the soft skins, you've got the fuel depots, you've got the dumps, you've got horse-drawn transport as well, which is pretty slow and pretty vulnerable. And then the other thing, the psychological thing, is not only the people on the ground, like the German soldiers who are driving these trucks and these other vehicles, because if they're putting reports of air attack, when the Germans are when they're planning operations and planning movements, they're taking into consideration air attack. So the threat from Allied air power is now playing on their minds, and whether that threat is real or imagined doesn't really matter. They're delaying, they're only moving at night because of this threat from Allied air power as much as they possibly can. And it's like here in the summer, it gets dark about 11, it's light again at 6, or 5 even. So you've only got these few hours when they perceive that they can move safely. And outside those hours, they're taking not undue care, but they're being ever more cautious. So just the psychological effect. So not only on the guys on the ground, but also on the kind of the higher echelons, if you like, is pretty significant. And to be honest, if I was under fire from a rocket or a bomb or anything, it would be terrifying. And then you imagine, like, there are lots of German accounts of driving towards the front, new units, and all they're seeing is columns and columns of burnt out vehicles, much like you saw in it was in Iraq or Kuwait. So it's a pretty kind of sobering sight if you're a new recruit and you've just got your job and you're just kind of driving your new tank or whatever, and all you're seeing is burnt out vehicles and sometimes burnt bodies as well. It's not really doing much for your morale, is it? Knowing that that's going to possibly be the what's awaiting you as you get closer and closer to the front.
I'm going to bring Matt in now because we've had a particular question for Matt from Patrick in Ireland. Why did the Allies not stick with guns as per the Hurricane? Why did they persist with the rockets? And also answer that one, Matt. And then if you would mind, do your talk again. I know I've heard it before, but I kind of love it. It's your greatest hit. And just talk about what it's like being a Typhoon pilot on one of those dive bomb runs in, and the experience of doing that. And just we've had a bit of a go at the fact that the success rates perhaps weren't where they are. But so why do we persist with rockets? And tell us about one of those actual dives in with rockets, Matt, please.
We persist because it's a hell of a lot of explosives. So when you look at the Hurricanes with the big 30 millimeter, I can't remember who makes them now, but they've only got I think it's 40 rounds per gun in them. A Typhoon with 420 millimeter cannons carrying 560 rounds plus 8 rockets, sometimes 10, sometimes 16 when they double rack them, or up to 2,000 pounds worth of bombs. So you can have a Hurricane 2D with its big cannons coming in for a moment, or you can attack with your rockets or your bombs and then spin round and attack 2 or 3 times with your cannon. So it's just the amount of firepower you're able to bring into a target area. Mike, I completely agree with everything Mike said. It's, the accuracy is, what you've got is a 100-kilo firework when you're talking about a rocket, and it's been put together by a guy in a field surrounded by dust with a hammer. So they're not exactly precision munitions. So you've got, I did the math somewhere and I can't find it now, but six rockets in a 3-second burst is equivalent to what HMS Caroline in Belfast put out at Jutland in weight of high explosives. So even if you're off your targets within that sort of 50-yard area, that's a lot of high explosive from one aircraft. So you want me to put you in the cockpit bit?
Yeah, please. Yeah, I love this. This is your your hit.
Yeah. So the bit I was sort of thinking about this is you're sort of 20 or 21 years old. You're in an aircraft that can do 400 miles an hour in level flight. It weighs, fully armed, a little over 7 tons. It's vibrating like anything. You're wearing oxygen the whole time because the carbon monoxide will knock you out. It's a beast. So you take off from your dusty field in northern France. You circle north to gain height because you weigh too much to climb quickly. You'll get up to about 8,000 feet where you'll form up, and then you'll head south. And as soon as you cross the bomb line, people are shooting at you. And sometimes before you get to the bomb line. So your sections are sort of weaving in and out, trying to maintain formation and trying to remember where you're going at the same time. So when you get to that point where you find your target, you then go through a quite difficult maneuver of getting everybody out of your finger fours into line astern. And then your CO will call a break and he'll lead you down. So depending on the CO, depends on what your attack is like. Now, John Golly in Day of Typhoon, his CO used to dive in at about 60 degrees. And if you ever see a Typhoon, the picture you put up before, 60 degrees would be the horizon being above the join in the canopy. So you're essentially standing on your rudder pedals. You're doing about 550 miles an hour, almost straight down. So if you imagine that, there's old Reg Brooker there. 60 degrees is looking almost straight up from where his head is in his aircraft there. So you're diving down. You're trying to gauge your altitude. So you're looking to release your rockets at about a few thousand feet up, mainly because that's a bit the point where they're going to be speeding up to their maximum effect. But when you hold back on the stick, something annoying happens with the Typhoon, because you've gone from about 7 tons down to about 4 or 5, and gravity is immediately playing its part. So you're doing 550 miles an hour straight down. You pull back on the stick, the nose comes up, you wham the throttle forward, the Sabre bursts into this huge amount of noise and exhaust fumes. You look at your altimeter and you're still diving. So you're going to lose about 500 feet before the power of the aircraft actually overcomes gravity. And by this point, you can't see the people that are shooting at you, but you've exposed your bottom to them. So the whole underside of the aircraft is exposed for these few seconds while you are trying to break away from the target. And this is where you're immediately looking around for your wingmen to see whether or not they're still there. And as is the case with fighter operations, as you pull out and you're racing away, everybody's going in different directions trying to avoid everyone. So you're probably only then gathering up 1 or 2 other aircraft as you head back to base. Because the next thing is you have to get home, you have to get refueled, you've got to get armed, and then you have to go do it again an hour later. So it's momentary terror at 550 miles an hour, racing to the ground as quickly as you possibly can with people shooting at you, which couldn't have been
amazing
nice
stuff. And just again to bring Adam in, can you give us a similar, I know we're going back to a topic we did earlier, but your troop carrier work, Adam, just perhaps describe the last sort of 15 minutes for a pilot of a C-47 flying in on D-Day or Market Garden. How many balls was that pilot juggling at that point?
Well, one of the things that obviously we spoke about earlier was the fact that when they crossed the west coast of the peninsula, they hit what some described as a wall of fog, which they didn't know they were going to hit. So one thing that's worth pointing out is that obviously all their training, one of the things that they fly almost daily was formation flights, learning to keep this formation as tight as they could, which was necessary for an airdrop of paratroopers. And one of the things that's worth pointing out, is that their formation up until they reach that west coast of peninsula is immaculate. So they've done their jobs as well as they can. They're pleased at that point because they've flown between the islands of Guernsey and Jersey. And as they were briefed, the flak on those islands drops short of their formation, which is a bonus. And then all of a sudden, I'd like to read a quote to you if possible. It was from a guy called Martin Wolf, who was a radio operator for 36th Troop Carrier Group. He says, a few minutes later, as we reached the western coastline, disaster loomed upon us. What he's talking about is the moment that they hit this cloud bank. He says, we slammed headlong into a dense cloud bank. It throws everything that they prepared for completely into the fan, basically. They have to make a quick decision on what they're going to do. And obviously the primary decision maker is the pilot, but obviously he's going to bank on his co-pilot. He's also going to rely heavily on his navigator. In fact, a lot of pilots probably turned around immediately in their cockpit and said to their navigators, what do we do? Are we flying in the right direction? So as I explained earlier, their options are basically to fly below the cloud, directly through it, or above it. And each one poses its own problems. If we take, for example, the guys that fly through it, their biggest problem is maintaining the formation. C-47s had a series of formation lights on them that could only be seen by other aircraft if they were flying at the correct intervals, if they were flying the correct distance apart. So the moment they fan their formation out in order to break the formation and alleviate the risk of collision, they become invisible to one another. Martin Wolf actually says in his book, and I'll admit I haven't had the time to quantify it to see whether or not this actually, he did actually say this, but he claims that James Gavin said that when they entered this cloud bank, he stood at the door of his aircraft and couldn't see the wingtip of the aircraft he was on board. Just to give you an idea of just how dense this wall of fog, this cloud cover was. And at that point, it's relatively quiet, because if the troop carrier pilots can't see each other, then German Flak can't see them. So it's relatively quiet. So you've got to imagine that the pilots are flying their aircraft at this point, trying to figure out what to do, they've got no idea when this cloud bank's going to break and whether or not they'll actually be able to have any sort of visual contact with their drop zone, and even whether or not they'll exit the cloud bank still flying in relatively the right direction. You can imagine that with the aircraft as it was and the navigational equipment it had on board, when they fan out the formations, if you're off your flight path by half a degree, by the time you've flown 5, 6, 7, 8 miles, you're flying in the wrong direction basically for your drop zone. And then all of a sudden the cloud breaks and there's a wall of flak and anti-aircraft fire coming up towards you. Everyone talks about it being like the 4th of July, and they talk about mainly the being able to see the tracers flying up towards the aircraft. And as Matt rightly said earlier, there's ways of telling whether or not the flak that you can see is dangerous to you or not. Generally speaking, when you're looking at the cockpit of a C-47, if you can see it, it's probably not going to do you much harm. It's the stuff that's below you or stuff you've already passed that's going to be particularly dangerous to you. And the pilots still at this point trying to figure out where they are. They're trying to figure out whether or not they're still on the right flight path. They're trying to look for these ground terrain features, which they point out. Again, Martin Wolf points this out. They're looking for rivers. They're looking for road networks. They're looking for key villages or towns. And obviously, in particular, with the American airborne mission, they're looking for flooded areas around the Murder and the Douve rivers as key features in the moonlight. all this whilst, obviously, like I say, the Germans are trying to shoot them out of the sky. They've probably also got the jump master of the aircraft standing over their shoulders, asking them where they are, when they're going to get the red light, when they're going to get the green light. An element of panic is probably, very, very much sort of set in on board the aircraft. But this is when their training really, really kicks in. Those who are lucky enough will see something that registers as a landmark, or they'll know that they're generally in the right area, which for most of them is the case. As Sean pointed out, well, actually, sorry, Paul, as you rightly pointed out earlier, most of them were within a couple of miles of their drop zone. That's what was deemed a misdrop to them. But for a paratrooper, that's nothing. It's within the realms of being able to get to their right objective within, an hour and a half of landing. And most of them are capable of doing that because they can see key terrain features. They can see the flooded murder rate. They can see, they can see St. Mary-Glees, for example, up ahead, or they can see Carentan up ahead, or whatever they're looking for. And as soon as they've given the green light to drop their paratroopers, at that point, the aircrew can start to think more along the lines of self-preservation. So, in one of the troop carrier orders, for example, they're told almost it's a man for themselves. If they're capable of navigating their way back to the UK, do whatever's necessary to get your aircraft back and get your crew back safely. Whether that was to climb to an altitude where the flak was less dangerous, or whether that was to descend, almost a treetop level and hope that you're flying at such a pace that the Germans on the ground can't really affect you in terms of flak before you're too far gone. So yeah, I mean, a lot's happening very quickly for these guys. And as we all know from, obviously we've none of us are in the position to be able to say we know what it feels like, but we've all probably been in jobs in the past where there's a lot of pressure put on you, or we're in high pressure scenarios, and when you're in that situation, time flies by. Everything all goes very quickly. So these guys are having to think very quickly, and like you pointed out, most of them did their jobs almost on the dot, or did their jobs and got the guys down reasonably close to their DZs.
My takeaway from this so far, and we'll see how long we want to keep on going. We've got another 21 minutes to break the machine gun show. If we want to go for that record, if anyone wants to go and do something else, fine. I mean, I could just talk on my own, but we've got 21 minutes to beat the machine gun show that was 2 hours and 27 minutes. But my takeaway is the speed with which things can go wrong in the air compared to the speed with which things can go wrong on the ground. If you're a tank commander and you're edging your way through the bocage, and you can kind of put your nose out a bit, back in a bit, put your nose out a bit, probe a bit down there. You send a guy out, have a look over hedge, have a look over that field there, look for your binoculars, make a decision. That's very, very different to flying in at the speeds we're talking about in a Typhoon, or even at the other end of the scale. The C-47 is a lot slower than a Typhoon, but there's still, even at 90 miles an hour, there's not much, time to get out of something if it goes wrong. So, Mike, from a Canadian, we haven't talked about the fighter role very much, and with Canadians, we have some real amazing air races in Normandy. People like Lloyd Chadburn and what have you, people like that, and Johnny Johnson and all those guys. Going away from the Typhoon, leaving Matt out of it for a bit, we can bring him in again later. The traditional fighter role. Tell us a little bit about how that was in Normandy.
Yeah, and I think your previous point is an interesting one about almost the randomness of the air battle in terms of who lives and who dies. And Raymond Collishaw was a fighter pilot in the First World War who in 1918 did a whole lot of close air support, trench strafing type of stuff. And he made a really good point that applies as much to the First World War as the Second World War, that when you're up in the air and you're dogfighting, it comes down to the skill of the pilot to a lot of extent. The more experience you have, the more training you have, the better pilot you are, the better eyesight you have, will have a big role to play in how well you survive and how long you survive in the air. When you get down doing sort of close air support, there's a much more random feature, and they found it in the First World War that it didn't matter if you were a brand new pilot or an experienced hand, that once you got down and you're dealing with ground fire, and sort of the randomness of those kind of attacks, anybody could get it, whether you're the oldest hand on the squadron or the newest one, and experience didn't count for much. And in Normandy, it was very much the same thing. Flak was the great equalizer. It could take down anybody. All you had to do was be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So it was a very dangerous mission for pilots, and the Typhoon squadrons especially suffered very heavily from those kind of missions.
I think that ties in with what Adam was saying about the troop carrier as well. I mean, if you're unfortunate enough to be shot down, it's not because you've done anything bad. Just it was, you know, your number was up. You know, you're flying in a formation, and the flak hits one aircraft, doesn't hit the other aircraft. Pilot mistake has not come into it at all. It's just the luck of the draw. So let's get back to some myths again now. So the Typhoon perhaps isn't the tank killer we think it is, but it is incredibly important in other regards in the Battle of Normandy. Sean, when you know you're a tour guide like me, and you know spend how many hundreds of customers you take a year, not this year obviously. When Airpower comes up in conversation, what are the things that people think that you have to kind of say, well, no, that's not quite right? Is there something in Normandy that you think of?
Yeah, going back to earlier, actually, the Luftwaffe, you know, their perceived absence, not only on D-Day, but throughout the campaign. You know, there's this idea that, you know, I mean, we spoke earlier about air supremacy, air superiority, and how you define the difference is, you know, up to you, I guess. But it's, you know, there was Walter Gall wrote this report about the German Air Force in Normandy. He said at times they were operating at odds of 40-1 against, you know, one German aircraft for 40 or so Allied planes. But they were there, and they were, you know, a bit of a hapless task, if you ask me, but, you know, that's their job. So they were trying to, obviously, they have several roles. I mean, they try and do something about the ground attack aircraft, okay, using fighters. They also try and do something about the aerial observation aircraft, which are a real pain in the neck if you're German. You know, you hear the little buzzing of a Piper or whatever above you, and, you know that something bad's going to be coming your way pretty soon, so they have to deal with those. And then also shipping. You know, they're flying up, they're dropping mines in the once the artificial harbor established, and they're using their typical kind of German new technology, if you like. So they're using the radio guided bombs, the Fritz-X and the Henschel 293, and also I think you had the first use of the Mistel, the mistletoe. So you have the single seat fighter above the Junkers 88 that's had the cockpit removed and the warhead replaced with it. They use those off the coast. I think they claimed one battleship sunk, which was the Corbeil, which was part of the artificial harbour off Juno Beach, but they didn't know that, so it had already been sunk. But you know,
yeah. Well.
But yeah, they were there, and they were causing problems. And Matt mentioned there was the guy Huppertz who shot down the 3 Typhoons. But you know, and as Mike said, you can have experience in that. When you're up in the air, your experience and your skill does count for a lot. But when you're operating at odds of 40-1. Even if it's 20-1 or 10-1, eventually that skill is not going to be enough. And I think 3 days later, Huppertz was killed because, you know, his little flight of planes was bounced by Allied planes, and the Germans are running out. You've got, I think, Spatz 2 days after D-Day decided the American focus was going to be on oil production. Without oil, planes don't really do very well. No. You've got inexperienced pilots, you know, with say minimal training, and they're having to learn to a certain extent on the job, a bit like the RAF and the Battle of Britain, if you like. And it's taken a toll. But you know, to consider them irrelevant or absent as a bit of a fallacy, if you like. So I do try and get that across, that they were still a threat, both on the ground and up in the air.
Yeah, and I mean they're performing a kind of a guerrilla warfare aren't they? They're in the Luftwaffe in their limited kind of hit and run. They can still do some damage. They're not going to swing the tide, but they're still there. They're being a pain in the ass. It's irritant, isn't it? It's not significant. They're not going to change the flow of the battle, but they're just the itch you can't scratch from the Allied point of view, aren't they? I suppose, really.
I think so. But I think they're significant if you're under attack from them.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah. No, I mean, I'm not belittling.
In the bigger picture, then yeah, it's their role is minor, but it is there, and you know, it is kind of I think important to stress that they weren't just so it wasn't just the 2 planes on D-Day and that's it. You know, there was a whole lot of other.
I'm bringing Mike now because you know, Mike, you lecture a lot. You had a lot of classes, and you educated people. And what things do people come in believing about air power that you swiftly have to shoot down in flames, no pun intended. Actually, it was intended. And by the way, people are saying, go on, we should keep on going. We've got to break the record. We've got people saying, you know, it's excellent, keep on going. So, yeah, what myths do you like busting?
Yeah, there's a few. I mean, we've all seen Saving Private Ryan, and that first 20 minutes is absolutely outstanding in terms of the representation of men under fire. But the movie does a real disservice to our understanding of close air support, because there's that penultimate moment at the end of the movie when Tom Hanks' character is sitting there and about to be overrun by the pilot coming across the bridge. And all of a sudden, like the cavalry rolled, two P-51 Mustangs come flying in right at the exact right moment, drop their bombs with unfailing accuracy, and blow up that Tiger tank just before it's able to do what it wants. And seems to confirm every idea that people have about TAC air and its ability to impact the battlefield and be accurate and timely and everything like that. So that's problematic right there. You need to be really careful about the German generals and what they have to say about Allied air power, because I think, as everybody knows, the memoirs they wrote were very self-serving, trying to put themselves in the best light. But in many ways, air power is the perfect antidote for them, because by chalking up their defeat in Normandy or in the Second World War to air power, it kind of absolves them of any blame, because they can always say that air power was the reason we lost. We couldn't move in the daylight. We lost our tanks. We lost our transport to these air attacks. And there was absolutely nothing we could do about it. And it sort of takes the blame off that German commander, because he really couldn't do anything about it. It was a factor that was out of his control. It was Hitler's responsibility, or Goering, or somebody further up the food chain. So they like to talk about how effective Allied air power was. And in some cases, they're right. In some cases, there's kernels of truth in that. But it's quite easy to see that they sort of overemphasize its effectiveness, because it really takes the spotlight off other failings of the German army in Normandy, of which there were quite a few.
I think that's a very good point. That came up in the show Sean and I recorded about the Germans, is that it's just amongst the Germans who are surviving, who are finding things to blame on each other, and blaming the air power is a nice, the Allied air power, stop us doing everything. It's a nice coverall, isn't it, I suppose, really. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So Matt, let's bring in you, and then we'll go around the house again. Myths about the Typhoon. When you're there inviting all your guests and sponsors come down that you're trying to get money out of, and people come along to see the aircraft, the airframe you're restoring, and what are the number one things you have to tell them that about the Typhoon that they go, oh, I didn't know that, because there must be several.
Oh, there's plenty. The ones we get the most are, you have the tank buster thing, which, if we're honest, we usually let that one slide a bit until someone's slightly more paid up. But when most people think Typhoon, they think of an unreliable engine and the tail falling off. And if we take the tail falling off, you know, and you and I discussed this at Chalk Valley at length last year, is the jump from sort of Hurricane to Spitfire to Typhoon, when you get into science, is quite a bit. Hurricane to Spitfire isn't that much, but as soon as you're going through 400 miles an hour, physics changes, because the air doesn't want to get out of the way as quickly as it does 50 miles an hour lower. So when the Typhoon starts operating at the level it is, with technology that isn't up to the job, you have structural problems. So the same as when the Comet had its metal fatigue problems, that was a new phase of understanding. The Typhoon's test pilot, Philip Lucas, famously said that with the Typhoon, they discovered aerial compressibility and didn't really realize it because they were too busy trying to fix the problem. So, you know, this idea that this aircraft was structurally flawed and it was a bad design isn't necessarily true, because they fixed those problems quite quickly. Yes, I think it's 27 aircraft were lost through its career with a structural problem, and quite a few pilots, unfortunately. Of that, I think 17. But in the great scheme of things, that's actually less than 1% of the aircraft losses. At the other end, you've got an engine which is twice as powerful as a Merlin, built by a company half the size of Rolls-Royce, and its development is considerably later than the Merlin and the Griffin. So whereas Rolls-Royce had the luxury of taking aircraft off the production line and running them to death, Napier were essentially building these things and they were going straight onto the aircraft on the line. So yes, the aircraft had its issues and the Sabre didn't really get sorted out until 1944. But luckily, the Sabre came good just when the aircraft was needed. And it made its name at Normandy with an incredibly high cost. So you said before, 249 aircraft lost and 269 aircraft and 149 pilots killed in sort of 80 days.
Of a force of what size?
The entire force, they only built 3,000 aircraft. So you're looking at 10% of those, just under 10% of those aircraft lost in sort of 2.5 months, which is an incredible thing. And the aircraft, unless you're tuning in and you are a bit of a Normandy nut, have never heard of it. It's not a Spitfire. It didn't do its business above the south of England. It did its work above occupied Europe, which is why the French, the Dutch, and the Belgians remember it so fondly. But here in the UK, it's mostly forgotten. So that's why we're rebuilding RB396 to be this living memorial for these crews that sadly have been, for the greater degree of it, forgotten. And that's why we have this passion for this aircraft, which failed as a high level interceptor, but came good as a ground attack aircraft and played an incredible role with very small numbers when you compare it to the tens of thousands of Spitfires or P-47s that were its contemporaries.
I think that's a very good point generally about how we perceive aircraft and equipment generally. I mean, the C-47, I tend to think of it as paratroopers and passengers. They're the two primary uses I think of, and that's from movies. That's from Bridge Too Far and Band of Brothers and things like the Wild Geese, when Richard Harris is trying to jump on at the end and stop being chopped down by the Simbas, and that cargo carrying role isn't there. And so, we have the same with the aircraft we have left today. There is no flying Typhoon right now. So therefore we're not thinking about it. There are plenty of Spitfires, a couple of Hurricanes, the odd B-17. There aren't. So there are some entire aircraft that won the war for us. There are no flying examples of, aren't there? And the German side of things, there's very, very few German aircraft. So I think being diverse in our understanding of air power is interesting. So we'll do another little round of myths. We've got another 6 minutes to go to break the record. So who wants to do a myth? Do you want to do a myth, Sean? Mike, who wants to do a myth? Or shall I do a myth? Or who wants to do a myth? Adam wants to do a myth. Yeah.
Marginally controversial one. Might lose a few friends, but
you haven't got any friends, Adam. So that's
it's true. It's true.
Less than me, though. More than me, though.
This is a more recent one, really. But it's and I've been told that. I've been told by quite a few people that it's splitting hairs, and I don't believe that it is. And that's in the public perception of the aircraft. That's all brother. And I'm sure you can probably see where I'm going to go with this, which is right. Which is the marketing material and the PR and all that. And Matt's someone that will know just as well as anyone what difficulties are faced by people that are trying to restore an old aircraft and the ways in which funding is created. And so I just want to get it out there that I can understand why the Commemorative Air Force felt the need to brand that Soil Brother as the lead aircraft of the American airborne invasion on D-Day, which I think it wasn't, and I'd like to think it's a fact that it wasn't, and that instead the aircraft flown by Joel Crouch, the first Pathfinder aircraft with Captain Frank Lillyman's Pathfinder team on board, was the lead aircraft of the American airborne part of the Normandy invasion. Now, the reason that I believe it's important that although, as I say, the reason that it's been sort of labelled as the lead aircraft is to help in the fundraising process. I think the reason why we have to be careful with that is because before that sort of reached its drop zone on Normandy, there were Pathfinders dead on the ground from the 101st Airborne Division. And I feel that it's very easy for people to say that the Pathfinders were the first Americans killed on D-Day. So why was Joel Crouch's aircraft not the first aircraft over Normandy on American aircraft over Normandy on D-Day in terms of the airborne mission? I think it's as simple as that. When the when there are personnel dead on the ground as part of Mission Albany, it was the same mission code name that Vatsal Brother was involved in. I would just like to take the opportunity to those who still believe that Vatsal Brother was the lead aircraft, just to say I think that that's unfair on the Pathfinders, not just the airborne Pathfinders, but the crews that flew the aircraft. I think that's unfair on them. So that's a quick, more recent myth that's been created over the last few years that I thought I'd get in there.
I have no problem with you saying that, Adam, and I from what I've read, I believe you're correct on that. And I have to say, I generally don't like the ideas of things being first, most important. You get that with, which village was liberated first. The point is they were all being liberated at the same time. Who was the first killed, which is the biggest, which is the best. That's the top trumps version of history, which I just hate generally.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Vatsal Brother is an incredibly historically significant aircraft. I mean, it was, well, first of all, it was flown by John N. Donaldson, who was the Group CO for the 438th, and obviously, this was the airfield that that Eisenhower visited as the paratroopers were preparing for D-Day on the 5th of June. And there's even Signal Corps footage of the aircraft taxiing out to take off. So it is an incredibly significant, historically significant aircraft. And there's a part of me that just thinks, leave that where it is. Emphasize the importance of the aircraft from that in that regards, and try to edge away from the like you say, the competition of we were first. And although, like I say, I've been told by a number of people over the last sort of month, couple of months, year or so, that it's splitting hairs. I just don't believe that it is. Particularly, like I say, when you factor into it the fact that there were Pathfinders already on the ground, already killed in combat, prior to Vatsal Brother reaching its drop zone on D-Day.
Well, I think there's stuff you can speculate about. You can speculate about, who killed Michael Vittman or whatever, but there's certain things that are facts. And if an aircraft was, was not the first, and you're saying it's the first, then it isn't the first. That's a factual error. So, did you just put your hand up, Sean, or were you scratching your nose?
Not scratching my nose, but I will just add it. That's all right.
I mean, the only thing.
Just add something though.
Yeah, sure,
I think
of course.
To emphasize what Adam's saying, I think it does a bit of a massive disservice to those that have already died. When you claim this other aircraft to be first, and it doesn't really matter, like you say. And if the IAF hadn't made this claim in the first place, there wouldn't have been any fuss, would there?
Yeah, no, definitely. They didn't. I can't see what saying first is going to get them any extra money. Just say one of the first. What's the difference?
I don't know. It's just this kind of strange way we are today, when we have to have specifics like that, when it really doesn't matter.
The only other thing, the subject, I got an email this morning from someone, is, are we going to tackle whether or not the bombing on D-Day worked or failed, or why it worked in some places and didn't work? Is that too big a subject to tackle now in a few minutes, or should we leave that for the show? Do we have a go?
Grab a beer or something?
Sorry?
If I've got time to grab a beer or something, then maybe, but...
Well, I don't. If you want to tackle, that you get that a lot. It didn't work on Omaha, did work on Utah, did work on Sula. Does anyone want to tackle that, or is that too big a subject, or do we go back to other myths? Who's got an idea? Matt? Mike, let's bring Mike.
Mike's got his hand up. I think that's
let Mike.
He's being properly pleasant about all this tonight.
There's so much we can talk about, and we could go on for hours here. One thing that I think is worth mentioning is about friendly fire and the casualties caused by the air forces. And we've touched on French civilians, and we could do a whole show on that, because I think that gets overlooked far too much. Steve Burke has written a really excellent book called Beyond the Beach, which looks at the impact of the Allied bombers and fighter bombers on French civilians. And there's been a lot written about the impact of the heavy bombers on friendly troops, Operation Cobra, Operation Total Eyes, and especially Tractable. But the Tactical Air Force has also had problems with attacking friendly forces. There's a really revealing report written by 1st Canadian Army of a period from about the 16th to the 18th of August, where mobility has just been restored to the battlefield. And they're able to chronicle at least 52 separate attacks by fighter bombers. And we're talking about Typhoons, Spitfires, Mustangs, Lightnings, Thunderbolts on 1st Canadian Army troops. And they've found that there's at least 77 men killed, some 350 wounded, 60 or 70 vehicles destroyed. So in aggregate, we're talking about probably men being killed in 1s and 2s and 3s kind of thing. But in aggregate, these are very substantial losses. I mean, think about what would happen today if we had 77 men killed in 2 days by friendly fire. There would be national commissions and front page stories and everything like that. But in Normandy, it was just another part of the battle, and it was unfortunate. And there was a lot of words between the Army and the Air Force to try to get these things sorted out. But it happened, and it was just considered sort of the cost of doing business.
Well, definitely. I mean, Leslie McNair, wasn't he? Was given one of the people given a task of general terms, improving air and ground cooperation, and ironically, he got killed on the ground by Allied bombs. So there's a weird, sick irony there. But I mean, the moral, the bigger question, so philosophically, is whether these losses, these friendly fire losses, were worth it in the end, and were they acceptable? I mean, any unnecessary collateral damage, I think, you'd like to say it's unacceptable, but at the same time, there's a lot of civilians that are in the way of the battle, and there are lots. It's a very, very complicated, nuanced subject. But you're right, it needs more discussion. That book you mentioned, I bought it last year. It's a very, very exceptional book, and I don't like Anthony Beevor's Normandy book particularly, but the one aspect I did kind of admire is he's trying to bring up the thorny subject of civilian losses in Normandy. And you can ask 150 Normandy tour guides how many French civilians were killed in Normandy. They'll give you 150 different figures, because there are totals that vary by not just a few hundred, they vary by thousands, these figures, because of the loss of life under some of the cities like Caen, Le Havre, where you didn't even recover all the dead. So it's an interesting and unfortunate side effect of the Normandy campaign. I think it's for a visitor to Normandy or Battle of Vergennes, it's very difficult to go and pay your respects to people killed by collateral damage, because they wouldn't be listed separately. They wouldn't be like a cemetery of people who are killed by one friendly fire instance. It's hard to understand it, I think, and see as a tangible thing. I mean, Matt, was that amongst the Typhoon pilots and things you read? Were they aware when they went back to the bases sometimes that they had hit civilian targets? Was it ever discussed?
It's difficult to tell. I think that I've read very few incidences where the ORBs are interesting things. The summaries give you some interesting color into squadron life, but the majority of the time, the phrase "all weapons in target area" is written against a sortie, and that is quite a vague statement. I think they did know, but a lot of the time they were given a target which was a house in this area. So, as Mike pointed out earlier, how hard it was to pinpoint a target. So, I think for a degree they probably did know, but it's not often recorded in the sort of in the major works. And unfortunately, the Germans did have a nasty habit of not exactly clearing the areas that they were in. So, if you were actually attacking a target, the house next door might still have all the families from the town in it. So it's one of those things that I think needs more research, but I just wonder how that could be done, considering what sort of resources we have to go through.
Yeah, and the time since the war. Yeah, but I think we'll bring things to an end fairly soon, because Sean's right. It's beer o'clock. It was beer o'clock an hour ago, I think. But yeah,
can I end on a sort of a fun story about an Irishman in Normandy?
Yes, if it's not offensive, because you can't.
No.
But yeah, no, please, that'd be brilliant. I'd love the idea of a fun story about an Irishman.
So I've got sort of two Typhoon heroes. One's a Canadian called Harry Hardy, who unfortunately passed away last month. Remarkable man. But the other one's an Ulsterman called Killy Kilpatrick, who was the first Typhoon pilot to survive the tail coming off, because he was lucky to be at 30,000 feet when it happened. So when his head popped through the canopy and the cloud base woke him up, he was able to get out before it crashed. And that helped Hawkers understand what was wrong with the aircraft. But during the Battle of Mortain, he was flying with 193 Squadron, and he was in his usual aircraft, which was DPA. He was hit as he pulled out of his attack, and force landed just outside of Veer. And there was another Typhoon that was up on its back, and he sort of pitied the poor fool that was in it, and he made a run for a hedge. And when he got through the hedge, he found a tank, and he got under the tank. And quite happily sat there while a firefight went on between some German troops and an American unit. What they didn't know was that the Typhoon that was up on its back still had its pilot strapped in it, a chap called Bob Lee. Bob ended up spending 5 days in that aircraft as it was being shot at, before some Americans went to have a look for it to take some souvenirs and found him still alive. But while Bob was trapped in his Typhoon, Killy was captured. He was taken behind the lines by a small group of German troops, where he was introduced to an American P-47 pilot, whose name was Emil Bizra. And they were sort of had all their valuables taken off them, sat down, and that night they started talking to their captors. And over the course of the evening, our gregarious Irishman convinced his captors to surrender because the war for them was over. And they did. So then they started walking back towards Allied lines. And the next day, they bumped into about 20 Austrians who immediately wanted to know what they were doing. And apparently they could tell they were Austrians because they had shiny buttons on their uniform. So Killy, through his translators, managed to convince them that the fighter bombers were looking for soldiers with shiny buttons because they were easy targets. And they all surrendered to Emil and Killy as well. So by the time they found an American unit the next day, they'd rounded up 30 German and Austrian troops. And at one point, they sort of managed to get a couple rifles off them and managed to walk back. So he was gone for 4 days, returned with 30 prisoners and an American. The Americans were quite pleased because they gave him a lift back to his unit. And he walked into the officer's mess tent just as the bar was closing, which is not something you do to an Irishman who's had a bit of an adventure. So the CO shouted, "Keep the bar open." And the party ensued to go on to the early hours. Until Killy woke up 2 days later when they found out that the doctor had slipped him a Mickey to sedate him so that he could catch up on his sleep. And that is just one of the many stories of Killy Kilpatrick. His nephew Tony Knight is the secretary for the Typhoon Entente Cordiale Trust, which works to bring old Typhoon pilots together with modern Typhoon pilots, and they run the memorial at Noyers Prakash, which is wonderful. You should go see it. But
that's a great story. And for those watching, if you haven't watched the interview I did with Adam Lunny a couple of weeks ago about Aussie Spitfires, Adam tells a great story. I'll let you watch the interview to see it properly. About an Aussie pilot, Spitfire pilot, was shot down, and he was the resistance hit him, and they told him to pretend he was deaf and dumb, but his hair needed cutting at some point. So the French took him to a German military barber to have his hair cut. I just think that's a really cool story. This poor guy's sitting there thinking, "Oh my God, they've taken me to a German to have my hair cut." You can watch the full story on the interview with Adam. That's pretty good. Adam was watching whatever ungodly hour it is in Australia. But yeah, we'll bring it to an end. Has anyone got any closing remarks they want to make? I think we've covered the fact that civilians' losses are not insignificant, and I think, perhaps we'll turn back to Mike and this. You said you dropped that hint that air power isn't the absolute winning factor of the war, and I think it is as a factor as important as any others, and you can't take you lose one of those factors: artillery, air power, naval support, technology on the ground, number of. You take one of those aspects away, and perhaps we're not the force we were. But to say it's any one of them on its own, I think is perhaps wrong. But I mean, I think generally air power is undervalued by a lot of people who come to Normandy, certainly because they think about the ground battles. Is there something you want to quantify your remark about not being so perhaps the winning factor?
Yeah, I think a couple points I'd like to make. One is that Jean Terrain is very categorical in that air power was the decisive factor, and I just don't see that. I don't see any one factor as being decisive. I think it's much more, let's call it a symphony. And if you've got the trumpets or the violins or the bass or any one instrument isolated, it's not going to sound very good. But as soon as you get all those instruments playing in harmony, it makes this beautiful music. And that's what the Allied victory was in Normandy. It was the result of the symphony, not any one particular factor. The second thing is there was a historian who made the point that the RAF and the Army were perhaps fighting two separate campaigns in Normandy, that the RAF was fighting its own campaign, largely interdiction, armed reconnaissance, and they were very good at it. But it wasn't exactly the battle the Army was fighting, and they certainly weren't fighting what the Army wanted them to do. But in the end, it all worked out very well, and air power did have a significant impact on the outcome of the campaign.
Anything, Sean, to add to that?
No, I'm done. I think, yeah.
Beer o'clock then. I think, well, the feedback this has been of the talks I've done. This has been one of the most commented on. It is the regulars here, but it's been going on, and Adam has stayed up till 6:40 a.m. That's Adam Lunny in Aussie, so he's obviously he couldn't switch off, so that's good. So or he got up early, whatever the hell it was, but yeah, no, I mean, it's a subject you could run with, but I think we've dispelled a few myths. We've given people a bit of information, and just to plug all your various projects and things. So Sean's website is linked below. Sean is a tour guide. When tours start coming again, he'll take you around the battlefields. Adam Berry, your website. I'll bring up the photo of your book that is about air power. Where's it gone? It's gone. There we are. You co-wrote with Hans, breathtaking spectacle about volume 1, a 52nd troop carrier wing. It's a massive, great, one of those massive, great, full of photos, full of accounts, an incredible book. People have been asking about how to get more information about the troop carrier roles. Well, there's one book, and Adam is active on Twitter. You can give you some other book titles, I'm sure, as well. Mike, there's loads of books Mike's done. The Canadian Guide to the Battle of Normandy, the battlefield there, that's one of Mike did with Terry Kopp. He lectures, there's articles, he's got his own website where you can link and find his own articles and things. He speaks about air power regularly. So Mike he clearly knows his subject, as we've all understood this evening. Matt, the Typhoon, tell us a little briefly about where people can find out more about the restoration project.
Head to hawkertyphoon.com. That's
the link is below anyway, but yeah.
That's where you can get all the most information for that. Is good news is the rebuild is restarting after a COVID-19 enforced hiatus, which is fantastic. And we're having a fancy black tie gala in October. If anybody fancies coming, tickets go on sale at the end of the week. Yeah, is that Duxford?
Do I get an invite? Can I come?
Oh, I'm sure we can sort something out. Yeah.
Good, super.
But just on that, I'm just saying the night is going to open with the aircraft restoration company flying L specially for us. So we'll have a photo reconnaissance Spitfire doing a display just for our guests, which will be quite nice.
Well, fantastic. I might pop over for that. So great. So for those watching, click subscribe, click on the little bell to get notifications. I've got a day off tomorrow, nothing tomorrow. Then the following day, I've got George Luz Jr. coming on, talking about his father's role with Easy coming. So going to something a bit popular and the old band of brothers that people love those stories. Then we've got various other shows coming up. Battle Atlantic, David O'Keefe's going to come on and talk about Verrières Ridge later on in July. Might do a Charnwood one, probably, maybe, possibly. There's lots of things I'm working on. It's just juggling all the balls and getting all the historians together at the same time. Is sometimes a bit tricky, but we'll do that. But thank you for watching. I'll say good night, and everyone else everyone shout good night at the same time. Good night, everybody.
Good
Thanks,
night.
everybody. That's wonderful.
So thanks very much for watching, and if you'd like to become a patron of what we're doing here at World War II TV, the links are all below, and I've enjoyed it. It's we've broken the record. That's it now. The next panel discussion will have to beat 2 hours 45 minutes. So fantastic. That's another record done. So well done, everybody. I will end the stream, and I'll say thank you, everybody, for watching and joining in. The comments have been fantastic. I'm going to go back and read all the comments myself, because there were some great side discussions there about all sorts of things I'm going to go back and read. So it's only as good as the contributors. So thank you very much. So I'm ending the stream. Good night, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Good evening. Bye-bye. Over and done.
Thanks.
Right, the stream was over. So it's just us now, guys. That was brilliant.